This is the first region of Russia where gasoline cars will be completely abandoned.
Volvo called the deadline for abandoning internal combustion engines.
The UK will ban cars with internal combustion engines in.
We had the first region of Russia to completely abandon gasoline.
In Europe, there will only be
Traditional.
ban gasoline cars in the 2030th year.
The use of an electric motor. Japan. Sales of cars.
Will abandon Germany. Sweden. I am from the machines equal to 2026th year. Thank you, of course, but I don't want to listen to this nonsense anymore. Anyone who has been watching me for at least some time knows that I am very skeptical about the idea of electric cars. And when I hear some bravado about the ecology of green, white, blue or whatever bears, I always look at it with a grin. And apparently it's time to tell you why I think so. After all, now the opinion of the format of the type is very popular. Are you painted? But how? What about our kids? They will live in the world of the future and suffocate. And there will be plastic bottles for breakfast. They will cry, eat bottles and suffocate. Is this the future you want for your children, you? And global warming? And the carbon footprint? Or what kind of trail is there? I don't really understand what the trail is, but I know for sure that it is very, very important. Bitch. And there are 84 more variations of such nonsense, which are constantly uttered by Muscovites and Petersburgers, drinking their organic coffee from a recycled cup. And only Chelyabinsk and Norilsk, who light the exhaust pipe of a chemical enterprise instead of a cigarette, are like this. Come on, tell us about ecology, guys from Instagram. Yeah. Just don't forget to attach the bug to the post. At least you will be of some use. So my beloved, of course, I'm laughing at this obscurantism for a reason. Nothing random happens in the world, and all things have their own logic. And while I'm driving by, I'll fill up a full tank of my favorite high-octane gasoline. I'll burn it with great pleasure. And I recommend that you refuel with food properly. The new Burr story will be fascinating. And that's what you'll learn from it today. How and why did steam cars and electric cars defeat the war with the internal combustion engine? And why has no one remembered about the alternative for 100 years? How did religious fanatics and pharmacists from pharmacies affect the energy industry? How did the mysterious gas kill people at the jam factories? And why is only leaded gasoline written on the gas tank hatches? How can a few words bring down the entire world energy industry and cause global panic? How gasoline and exhaust gases destroy humanity, and whether electric cars will save us from a global environmental catastrophe. In general, if you stand in the position of a motorist and look at the situation, well, only from this side, then in Russia you can generally score everything. We stopped knocking out the plugs from the electric kettle there just a few years ago, and then not in all regions. Have you seen our distance? To be somewhere in the middle of the forest, where the only hole where you can stick the charging plug. It's your ass. This is a so-so situation. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about. Electric cars entertainment for capitals or Europe. Please, take off as you want. In the capitals, they have already lost all the ground under their feet anyway. In the center, there are bike paths for cyclists everywhere. They say that cyclists are also people. They're crazy, I say. And frankly speaking, we are not in a hurry with the norms of the Euro. And in general, they are not so worried about all these ecologies of yours as they're in Europe, for example. In theory, you can just hammer the bolt, say that you are there of course as you want, and we are here on gasoline. I feel great with gas. The bears are all dirty here anyway. No one worries. So go on your own, and put everything you can get your hands on there, into the socket, but don't touch us. We are orthodox, and go fuck yourself with gasoline. In theory you could say that. And that's it, the story is over. Subscribe to the channel, put likes, wait for a new Burr story. There will be even more exciting stuff. But anyway, we are with you, participants in global processes, and when all the concerns get into engines that will run on electricity, on recycled environmentalists or on white magic, we will not get away from it. No one will design anything specifically for us, and we will end up with all the same products of world brands and Lada Niva travel. Lada Niva travel, she is like Lenin, always with us, and very much wants to go to the ground. Therefore, what we will drive in the near future, and for the rest of our automotive life, will depend on foreign automobile companies, and on the heads of various states. And it is being solved right now. All things always have logic. In simple situations, it is obvious. For example, it is very logical not to put your hands in a transformer if you want to live. If you put your hand in, it will kill you. If you don't put your hand in, you will die later in some other way. In difficult situations, or in global issues, logic is not always obvious, since there are a lot of different pieces on the chessboard. But it is always there. Therefore, in order to properly deal with the situation, I started looking for logic from the very beginning of the automotive industry. And the first question I needed to find an answer to was why at the dawn of the automotive industry. It was the internal combustion engine that won, because there were electric cars and steam-powered cars. At the time of the beginning of the automotive industry, the type there was 1,900 years, all cars cost the same. The same. Oh fuck, it's important. But already in 1910th year, the cheapest transport of all was the Ford Model T, and in 1917th year, it was simply impossible to compete with this price, because the car cost several times cheaper than all other competitors. For this, of course, thanks should be said to Grandpa Henry Ford and his conveyor assembly method. We talked about his conveyor belt, and how Ford began in general, in a documentary about Detroit. Take a look sometime at your leisure. It is quite possible that if Ford had believed in steam cars or electric cars, the modern world would have looked completely different. But the history of the subjunctive mood does not tolerate. It happened as it happened. And I can only add from myself, God bless you, Henry Ford, for believing in the internal combustion engine. I hope you're flying in some kind of paradise at 12. Ford Model T appeared in 1908, as I hope we already know. And initially, the assembly process of one car took only 12.5 hours. By the standards of that time, it is almost instantaneous. And 2 years later, in 1900, the 10th year, 12,000 live copies were already produced, which already traveled on public roads. By this time, by the 17th year, the Ford production process was simply unattainable, since at that time the assembly of one Ford model took a little less time than 12.5 hours. Instead of 12.5 hours, this is 750 minutes, the assembly of one car was 93 minutes. How do you like this in the middle of the 10th years of the 20th century? How to compete with this? By the time of the 17th, 18th year, every second car on the road. This is Ford Model T. In the 17th year, Ford stopped buying at least some advertising to promote its car, so why? When you have half the flow. It's all one car, and the rest are automakers. That's all the rest. There is no sense in advertising at all. Everyone already knows about you, and wants to buy, because half of the flow. This is a weighty argument for buying. Such popularity, of course, the model got because of the price. When you have such an efficient production, that it takes only an hour and a half, from a pile of bolts and nuts to the finished car. The cost of the finished car does not differ much from the cost of all components. And the components will cost pennies if they are purchased in large volume. And that's the volume Ford had. Ford had such a voluminous volume that any volume would envy, if you know what I mean. In the 17th year alone, 735,000 Ford Model T models were produced, with a price of a ridiculous $500. $500 for 1917, that's about $10,000 for modern money. And 735,000 copies. This is more than all electric cars and steam cars produced in 1917 year from all manufacturers combined. And the very first advantage in the price of cars with internal combustion engines was due to Ford. So that you understand what Ford was competing with at that time, let's throw a little bit about steam cars first. Does everyone have this idea of steam cars? A hammer, a stove, firewood, coal, you're burning something there, and it's crawling somewhere there for some reason. Well, here's an example of the characteristics of one of the cars. Acceleration to 120 in 10 seconds, and a power reserve of 2,000 kilometers at one gas station. 2,000 kilometers at one gas station. If you did not catch the value of this figure, this is you filling up 90 liters of water in Moscow, going to Sochi, and you will still have a couple of Sochi rides. And you will not need to refuel along the way. These are the characteristics of the car double module C. And the creators of this miracle, the Dahl brothers, Amber, John, William and Warren. The secret of such a large power reserve was in the device of a steam boiler, or rather, in a tube that was 170 meters long, but at the same time, it was twisted in such a way that it fit into a tank of this size. 170 meters. It's about 56 floors. And so, a pipe 56 stories long was rolled up into such a container. Here's what it looked like. And because of such a length and small cross-section, the steam pressure turned out to be very strong, and at the same time, little water was needed. When the brothers showed this model at the automobile show in New York in 1917, they made a splash. Of the entire exhibition, it was the only car with a steam engine, and definitely one of the most striking exhibits. The audience was fascinated by this model. Fast, quiet, easy to use, with a reverse pedal. Let's get the back on this hood was much more convenient than on the others, if you know what I mean. And even, attention, with the engine start button. In 1917, steam car. Then there were no buttons as such, but they already had. During the 3 months of the exhibition, the Double brothers received pre-orders for 5,390 copies of the C module. The guys cheered. And Ford, I remind you, by this time was already riveting 700,000 cars a year. Plus, legal cars double cost several $1,000s. And the next model, the double module E, cost $12,000, which is about 13 to 14 million rubles for modern money. And if you count in Ford Model T, then for the price of one double module E, you could buy 24 Ford Model T. Yes, Doble were not the only company that produced steam cars. There were cars and cheaper. Of the relatively massive ones, there was also Stanley. These are such Tarantakas, but the circulations also did not stand next to the volume that Ford had. And there were hundreds of small-scale manufacturers of steam cars in general. When there is a product on the market that is about the same in terms of convenience, but costs several times cheaper, it is almost impossible to compete with him. And in fact, Ford single-handedly killed all steam cars by offering a cheaper product to the market. The fact that steam cars were inconvenient to use is not the reason for their failure. The main reason is that they cost significantly more than the Ford model. Gasoline cars were also not a model of comfortable use at that time. Everything is in oil, grease, exhaust. There were no mufflers then. If anything, all the liquids stink. Listen to how the first gasoline cars sounded. Against this background, the trains looked like salvation for respectable gentlemen. They were practically noiseless, not much noisier than modern ones, easy to operate, with a comfortable interior, and they did not in general look more like an elegant carriage than a car. So that you understand, in electric cars inside, as an element of the interior, vases with flowers were often placed. Well, check it out. Such a package of options, by the way, was called around some environmental killers, and I'm the only one here with mimosas. But apart from jokes, the electric locomotive was stupidly more convenient to use then, and also more prestigious. So bankers, lawyers, doctors and their spouses made a choice in favor of electric cars. Even Henry Ford's wife drove an electric car from Detroit Electric, the most successful electric car manufacturing company in the United States. It's good to notice. Yes, you heard it right. Henry Ford's wife rode trains and was proud of it. And Henry himself was not at all embarrassed by the fact that his wife drives a car of a different design and from a different company. He just knew that he was making the cheapest possible products for the masses and his wife. It's not cheap and it's not mass. This electric boiler appeared in 1907th year and stood on the conveyor right up to 1939th year. And Detroit Electric is considered the progenitor of all electric vehicles. This is the first and only electric car manufacturing company at that time, whose circulation was measured in thousands of units sold. Of course, you had to pay for comfort. Electric cars cost an average of $2,500. This, of course, is not $12,000 for a double module E, but this amount was not lying on the road either. For this money, even at that time, about 1910th year, it was possible to buy 8 Ford Model T cars. But it's basically like buying 10 rubber women instead of one normal one. Although, why buy a whole woman when there is leasing? Another important argument why electric cars were better is simple control. There were only 2 levers waiting for you inside. One was in charge of steering. You're sitting on the second. A joke, you sit on both at once, of course. The second lever, similar to the handbrake, was responsible for speed and reverse. Cutting down the back was much more convenient. A very important option for all activists, by the way. The only thing you can stick to is the speed limit. The maximum speed was only 32 kilometers per hour. But in the city there was no need for anything more. No one went faster in the cities, and there was frankly nowhere for the wives of bankers to hurry. The main thing is that you sat down, pressed the button, pulled the lever and drove. No dancing with a tambourine, and sticking your hands where you don't need to. Although sometimes, of course, I want to put my hand where it's not necessary, you know. But the owners of electric cars still do not know what libido is, so they do not understand. You can now wait, Kroshenidze. What are you rubbing in here? That electric cars were more convenient. How to charge this thing? Where to go? First of all, I do not know where you should go. Secondly, yes, that's right, there was a problem with charging. 120 years have passed, and nothing has changed. But there was exactly the same joke with gas stations. Gasoline at that time was generally sold in pharmacies, if anything, and more often it was used as bleach, not fuel. And not every pharmacy had it. And if you are surprised that gasoline was sold in pharmacies, then you just know that kerosene, for example, was then sold in grocery stores. I'm not kidding. Pasta, meat, vegetables, kerosene, fruit, bread. Nothing bothered anyone. In short, if you then had a car with an internal combustion engine, then you had no less hemorrhoids than the owners of an electric car. And if you also remember that there is a motor, the transmission should be serviced, lubricated there, everything, reassembled. Then in general, amen. The electric car in this regard was, as a design, much more advantageous. Even then, there was only an electric motor, a battery, wheels, and doom in the driver's eyes from the inside. That's it. Go enjoy. At the same time, since the electric bibs were positioned for people who have money, you could move your brain there, well, a little bit. Think, and come up with some cool thing for your customers. You Detroit Electric had brains. Modern marketers, keep in mind. Detroit Electric built their own 2-story charging station for their customers, where more than 100 cars could be charged at the same time. But the company provided not just a building with charging, but a whole service around. For $35 a month, the car was taken away from you every day, washed, polished, did that, and charged the battery. And in the morning, the car was driven to a convenient time and place for the owner. Bitch, service. You come home after your business, and an official, specially trained mechanic driver from the company is waiting for you there, who take your car away from you, and in the morning by the appointed time, your car is washed and charged, waiting for you at the porch. True, $35 then is almost $1,000 today, but still, these services were worth it even by modern standards. 30 chargers, 30 car washes, and 30 deliveries from home to home for $1,000, even with modern money. This is a great offer for a wealthy person, especially if you remember that the car itself cost $2,500, and against this background, $35. It's like a real penny. Detroit Electric had its peak sales in 1914. Then they sold 4,500 cars. Yes, it's still ridiculous to compare with the volumes of Ford, but coupled with the night charging service, electric cars were quite a comfortable car at that time. And the price tag in this case was not a big problem. Firstly, because absolute dominance in the volume of production is not always necessary for a happy life. Mercedes, for example, feels great, although it is far from the leader in terms of production. Secondly, if any company producing electric cars built production according to Ford's principles, they would be able to reduce the price gap. And the only advantage of the Ford Model T in price would not be so obvious. And in theory, it is impossible to squeeze competitors out of the market only at a price if you are inferior to them in the comfort of use. And I remind you, an electric car is sat down, pressed the button and drove. And not everyone could drive a car with an internal combustion engine purely physically. Because of the design features, you had to apply blunt, brute male force very often. And so, it was unrealistic for women and the elderly to use cars for the most part. It turns out that the car is sexist and ageist. How do you like that, feminists? Fuck it with maintenance and management. Even starting the engine was a very fun adventure back then. Who of you is older, he knows such a phrase as a crooked starter. Or garage style, Mikhailovich. For all adequate, what is it, what the hell is it? I'll explain now. In fact, it's just a metal curved stick that was inserted into the engine crankshaft. This is, in fact, such a main spinning stick of the entire motor, which turns the entire gearbox, drive, and the car goes. So, the crooked starter was inserted into the crankshaft, and the whole engine was scrolled with their hands to start it. From the movement in the motor, the compression stroke, the useful stroke were started, and if you turn fast enough, then at some point, the motor will start working itself. Here we have seen, for example, how lawn mowers, boat motors are started, and now, here they pull such a rope. That's basically the same bullshit. This rope is called a rope starter, in which you spin the crankshaft in the same way, scroll the entire motor inside, and if you are agile enough in this matter, the motor will start working. There are two problems here. Firstly, in order to start the engine with such a macker, you need to turn it straight sharply, boldly, and with effort, and it's not easy anymore. The average modern driver is unlikely to take out such an exercise purely physically. It's easier with a rope starter, because lawn mowers now have boat motors like this. And a big car engine. Go spin it, and even fast enough to make it work. And in winter with a cold engine, well, just generally amen. Secondly, when the engine was started after all, the starter started spinning along with the crankshaft, since it was, well, directly stuck into it. And that bastard was sitting pretty tight there. And if you don't know how to use this piece of iron, then knock out your fingers, shoulder there, or get this metal stick on your human stick. Not a problem at all. In short, the crooked starter is not only inconvenient, but also quite traumatic. And this mechanism was a pretty strong argument in favor of electric cars, which even then were launched simply with a button. Pressed and went. And the Ford Model T was launched with a crooked starter. I twisted it, freaked out, twisted it again, and most likely, took a taxi. But this whole situation was changed by one case. In 1910th year, a certain Byron Carter, starting his car in the morning, gaped a little, and received several blows from the crooked starter in the head, from which he died. I don't have any finishing touches to this proposal. The starter himself did a great job. So, by and large, he would have died and figs with him. The death of some person at that time, in some ridiculous bullshit, caused much less emotions than today. Especially if it happened there with some equipment, or in production. But this Byron Ironhead was not a simple man from the street, but a close friend of Henry Leland. And Gedry Leland. This is just the founder and owner of the Cadillac Lincoln Company. And the most important thing is that Byron got hit on the head by a Cadillac car. Leland, of course, was very upset by such a ridiculous death of a friend and felt guilty for this incident. I must say that Leland was an engineer to the core. The first Cadillac type of car was completely designed by Leland. And of course, when your brainchild naturally kills your friend, you will not be very happy about it. A friend will not return 100 now. The good news was that Leland did not do the usual things, like hang a candle on a black contact background, or shoot a black and white story in the rain on the windowsill, but decided to do something so that this situation would not happen to anyone else. And he didn't have many friends left by that time, he should have saved up. For a while, Cadillac rustled its engineering department, but they couldn't really come up with anything. More precisely, they managed to make a device that could start the engine itself without human intervention, but it was too large, and stupidly did not fit into the car. Leland realized that he would not be able to resolve this situation on his own, so he had to involve someone from the outside. And after some time, he stumbles upon the Delca company, which is headed by this character, Charles Catherine. This is a very important person for our material. We will come back to him personally. At this point, we need to understand the following. Charles Delca's company has been developing various solutions for a stable industry. In fact, it was such a bunch of garage engineers who came up with all sorts of things. And then, Leland bursts into this party and says something like this. I need my car to start with half a turn. Well, in general, if you want it that way, we'll write it down. Should work like your mom. How's she doing, by the way? We have it in common. I must say that many people have already made attempts to make some kind of automatic starter, but there was nothing sensible on the market. Nothing just stupidly worked. Catering bought one of these non-viable patents and started to finish it with his guys. And they did it. After a year of development, in the 1911th year, Catherine registers her patent use 1.150.523, which described the design of an electric starter for a car. And the funny thing is that the starter has reached almost unchanged to this day. This is essentially a small electric motor that is powered by a battery that you have in your car, and when you turn the key or press the button, the circuit closes, the motor starts spinning, the engine turns, and it starts. In fact, the person who independently unwound the motor at startup was replaced by a small electric motor. And this small, at first glance, invention no longer killed people, but killed the main advantage of electric cars over cars with internal combustion engines. Manual start of the engine from the starter curve. As soon as Leland was informed that there was a solution, he immediately sent an order for 5,000 electric starters. And at first, the starter was only Cadillac technology, and just a killer of features in sales. A car with an internal combustion engine that could be used with the same convenience as an electric one, but at the same time, that did not require constant night charging, was needed by everyone. All the other automakers realized pretty quickly that they also needed such a piece of shit. Someone tried to negotiate a deal for supplies, and someone tried to come up with some kind of their own stray. But Jem was the most competent of all. In the documentary about Detroit, he said that William Verand, the founder of General Motors, in the area of the 1520s, led an expansion to buy up absolutely everything that existed in the automotive world. Warehouses, manufacturers of spare parts and other components. That's all that is not nailed down, they bought everything. Well, here's the deal. They also bought along with all the technology. This happened 5 years after the invention of the starter, in 1916. And from that moment on, absolutely on all products, the Jem electric starter went as a basic option. Even the Ford Model T managed to screw it in 1919. But since Ford needed to maintain the lowest possible price, the starter was not in the base there, but went as an option for $30. And about somewhere from that time, from the 19th, from the 20th year, in general, on all cars with internal combustion engines, there was either an electric starter in the database, or it could be purchased as an option. Some automakers bought spare parts Delco. Someone still came up with their own, but it doesn't matter anymore. It is important that the crooked starter, as a phenomenon, began to go into oblivion. And when, from the point of view of starting the engine, the internal combustion engine became as convenient as the electric motor, the manufacturers of electric pipes no longer had any trump cards up their sleeves. There was nothing left to cover. The power reserve is the same, or even less. You need to charge all night and cost more. And even the sound was not such a problem even then, since in 1920 all cars already drove with a muffler, and no one could even think of exhaust gases at that time. Therefore, electric cars simply did not have any advantages over cars with internal combustion engines, and they quite deservedly went far away from the market. The formula of supply and demand is very fair. If something is not in demand, it has no right to life. And exactly this happened with electric cars at the dawn of the 20th century. The world needed a car with an internal combustion engine. And he won this war quite deservedly. Thus, we get that cars with an internal combustion engine, by the beginning of 1920th year, were cheaper than all the others, and in terms of usability, they were exactly the same as electric ones, and it was almost impossible to compete with the internal combustion engine. Cars with this type of engine were already simply pressed by the price, volume, and ease of use. But a car is not just a product on wheels, it's a whole huge industry, it's a whole world around. Just turn your head in some city, and you will see how the modern world is sharpened for a car. And when the industry got volume, when there were a lot of cars, they could no longer exist just like that, by themselves, in a vacuum. Electric starter and conveyor assembly method. This is, of course, good, but it's not enough to achieve world domination. Therefore, it is wrong to look at the history of the automotive industry in isolation from the context of what happened in the world, or in specific countries. And that's what I'm getting at. The ICE won not only because of improved design or assembly measures. The ICE became the uncontested leader because of the Prohibition law, which was adopted in the United States in 1919. For all the previous material, I said the word gasoline only 3 times. The first time was in the introduction, that I would go and refuel, and 2 more times when I said that it was then sold in pharmacies. Do you know why I did that? But because the internal combustion engine ran on gasoline. Yeah. Ford Model T, and in general, the first engines that Ford made were originally designed for the use of ethanol. And the prefix "ol" at the end of the word, as well as the increased salivation of all alcoholics who are watching this material now, tell us that it is alcohol. And the vast majority of cars with internal combustion engines then drove on alcohol. As all St. Petersburg students now drive on alcohol, so it was then. Cars mostly drove on alcohol. The point is that ethanol. This is an alcohol that is made from grain. But an ordinary farmer has a lot of this stuff. And ethanol could be made at home for very cheap, and drive your cheap car. Ford had just such a calculation. It would be strange if he, designed a cheap car for the masses, but at the same time, on a type of fuel that would be very expensive. And other cars, of which there was a minority, mostly drove on kerosene, which was also quite cheap at that time. Gasoline, as I said, was used then as bleach for the most part. And so, it wouldn't occur to you to refuel your vanished car, would it? That's when people didn't have such a thought. In order to properly track the logic, you need to throw a little context of the oil industry of that time. Now the young environmentalists will have a second to sing, because I will say that the use of oil at one time saved animals. Let's enjoy a little skinning, just a little bit, and I'll continue. We all know what fish oil is. Russian Instagram models will tell you, omega-3, but in Russian it's fish oil. Just fish oil. This is what is sold for 50 rubles in a pharmacy. And omega-3, this is something that can be sold on Instagram for 1,000 rubles, and they haven't eaten it before. Previously, people did not do such bullshit, but used it as fuel for lamps, street lamps, torches, and that kind of stuff. And in order to sit romantically in the evenings with an oil lamp, humanity hit the whales in droves. They took out fat from them, which was then called blubber, and they in fact created romance for themselves. Romance, and the aroma of burnt whale oil. And around the middle of the 19th century, people in their certain general mass add up to kerosene. In general, I'm talking because almost simultaneously in different parts of the world, different people have thought of boiling oil. And who was the first? It's not entirely clear, and it doesn't matter to us. Kerosene is obtained in this uncomplicated way. They take a vat of oil, heat it, pores are released from it, which condense, drain into another vat, and these are the pores, please. Kerosene. Or gasoline. Gasoline is released at a lower heating temperature, and kerosene is very large. Yes, the properties of gasoline and kerosene differ in that gasoline ignites instantly, and it is liquid, while kerosene is oily and burns slower. And at that moment, when there were no cars, gasoline in general, don't understand how to use it, because, well, you won't pour it into the lamp, it will explode momentarily, and it's not clear how to use more gasoline. But kerosene could just as easily replace whale oil, because it did not burn so quickly. But, how to make people stop using whale oil and start burning kerosene? That's right, of course, we need to bring a crowd of people to the streets with posters, "Stop killing whales." Or, "Is fat extracted from whales today, and what tomorrow? Will they extract money from our money?" And when people see these posters, everyone will immediately, of course, stop killing whales. Yes. Yet, this is exactly what is being done in the world. Fortunately, the world is a little more logical than the brain of an activist, so in order for fat to really become unnecessary, it is necessary to make kerosene cheaper and more accessible than fat, so that you can, roughly speaking, buy it on every corner and not go broke at the same time. And then, everything will happen by itself. Such is the magic that is called life and logic. For these tasks, in 1859, the first oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania, and small oil refineries began to appear there, which mainly produced kerosene. And then, they dug another hole, and another hole, built another factory, well, flew. The first batches of oil from these fields cost $16 per barrel. For modern money, it's $440. Then in the next 60, the price dropped to $9.50, and in the 61st, it fell to 49 cents per barrel. This is about $13 for modern money. 1 barrel, that's 158 liters. In short, oil was cheap, but the situation with kerosene was quite strange, since it cost a horse, although it was made directly from very cheap oil. And in terms of liters, the price of kerosene was an order of magnitude more expensive than oil prices. And one 20-year-old boy is like that. Interesting. It smells like money. Meet Johnny. By this time, Johnny already had his own small capital, which he had collected from trading grain, meat and all that. And the most important thing he had. This is a feeling that oil and kerosene have great prospects. And he also had a desire to establish the oil industry. Johnny had a partner in the grain, meat business. His name was Morris. The two of them find a chemist, Samuel Andrews, who was rummaging through how to get kerosene from oil, and so they decide to organize their own production for the three of them. The company was named Andrew Clark and Company, where Andrews is a chemist, Clark is a business partner, and End Company. This, apparently, is Johnny. In fact, all the guy started doing was optimizing and debugging absolutely all the processes that were in the algae. And what was there to optimize? Firstly, all the kerosene on the market was outright shit. The manufacturing methods were, well, just so-so, and the final product was obtained with a bunch of impurities, normal, did not burn, and very different in quality from barrel to barrel. If it's very on the fingers, here on these crooked fingers, then what did the guys do? As I have already said, kerosene was obtained from oil by distillation. This is when the vat is heated, vapors are released, they are collected in another vessel, and here's kerosene for you. But by this method, the product turns out to be quite dirty, since oil particles fly away along with kerosene vapors, and you have a fig of tar in the final product. Tar is just the same waste that is obtained during the distillation of oil. They are constantly shifting Khrushchev roofs there, and in general our generation knows it perfectly well. And when you have a fig of tar and kerosene, you get a mixture that burns badly, smokes and stinks. But if you pour a little sulfuric acid into this dirty kerosene, shake it well, and then let it stand for a while, then the tar and other impurities will peel off from the kerosene, and will stand in the lower part of the vessel. We open the valve from below, drain the tar, other shit, close it, and we end up with clean kerosene that burns properly, is ideal for lamps, lanterns, and is needed by everyone. And the guys were the first to introduce such a cleaning technology to their production. Secondly, at that time, about 40% of oil and refining was just thrown away. Like waste. You can't get kerosene from this oil anymore, and it's like there's no need for it anymore. Therefore, the remains were naturally poured around the corner. Environmentalists, look there, don't choke, I'm worried about you. The guys from this oil, in order not to throw it away just like that, learned how to make gasoline and paraffin wax. Nobody really needed gasoline then, but the dudes were able to use it at their power plants. Thus, they reduced coal consumption and saved on it. And paraffin wax flew off the shelves perfectly, because, well, everyone needed candles then. That is, the guys received more goods from each barrel of oil, and accordingly, more profit. Thirdly, it was necessary to understand that oil is extracted in one place, then transported to an oil refinery, which makes everything out of it there, and then the finished products go from this plant to warehouses, and then to the consumer. And it was precisely in transportation that the root of the very high price of kerosene was. Oil, kerosene, and in general any other liquid stuff was then transported in such wooden barrels, from which a noticeable part of the raw materials simply flowed out, since the barrels were wooden and were of so-so quality. And the tariff for transportation, besides, was still horse-drawn, since the railways had just appeared and were used very little, and the construction of up to was expensive. It was necessary to somehow beat off this business, so the price tag was high. The guys did it very simply with the barrels. They just bought a piece of forest, cut it down, and set up kidney production for themselves, purely for yourself. With this movement, they killed two birds with one stone. The first, they began to lose much less raw materials through the cracks, since their barrels just stupidly became better, they made them for themselves. Secondly, they reduced the cost of one barrel from $2.50 to $1. And as soon as the volume appeared, Johnny was able to push through noticeable discounts on the transportation tariff as a wholesale customer. And because of these three seemingly simple things, the guys got a huge advantage over all other market participants. And their products, as a result, were much cheaper in production, much cheaper for the end consumer, and of higher quality. As a result, for ordinary people, this resulted in kerosene becoming a very profitable alternative to whale oil. More precisely, he became a destructive alternative. 1 gallon of whale oil is, roughly speaking, 4 liters, well, 378, cost $1.77. And 1 gallon of kerosene cost just 7 cents. For the cost of 1 gallon of whale oil, people could buy 25 gallons of kerosene. And of course, everyone fell behind the whales and went quietly to burn kerosene, without a single poster and a torn throat, please note, although the throat of whale oil producers still suffered. After all, they didn't suck so much even from whales. All this led to the fact that the company began to grow very quickly, and 3 years after the launch of the company, the annual turnover amounted to $2 million. This is a huge amount of money at that time. Johnny understands that they are only at the very beginning, and that there is a real opportunity to capture the entire market in general, displacing absolutely all players from it. He attracts a couple of relatives and other entrepreneurs, and together they found a new company that was destined to practically rule this world. It was called the Oil Standard. Oh yes, and Johnny's last name was Rockefeller. At the time of its founding in 1870, Standard Oil controlled 4% of the entire U.S. oil market, but at the same time, it was already the largest company, since at that time there were only 250 producers in the United States. And not only did they dominate because of the reduced delivery rates, with free money, they began to buy up all available barrels for transporting raw materials, thus raising the price tag for their competitors and forcing them out of the market. And such methods led to the fact that in the 74th year, the PAL Standard controlled 25% of the market, and by the 80s, 85% already. Monopoly. Crystal clear. By the 85th year of the Standard Oil, it is the largest company in the world with huge influence, money, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and with 20,000 oil wells. And when you have, in fact, the basis of the entire economy of the country in your hands, you have a lot of levers of pressure on the government. There is even an interesting caricature of that time, that the Standard Oil controls everything in the country. They sponsored election campaigns, allocated money for charity. And in general, all important people were somehow kept in their bosom. It all happened exactly until this man became president. Teller Roosevelt. Roosevelt understood that monopoly is not good, and monopoly will always unreasonably raise the price, extract huge profits, and, at the expense of its resources, strangle all the small ones in the market. At the same time, no one will improve the quality of products, since the whole market is ours anyway. And besides, such a serious political player Roosevelt was not in the box office at all. Therefore, it was decided to break up the Standard Oil. How it happened from the inside, and what kind of underhand war took place there, is a separate story. We're not going in there today. We have enough without her, believe me. That's what's important for us to know. In the 1911th year, Standard Toil splits into 34 companies. Of the modern companies who are former Tetraethyl, it's like ESA, Mobil, BP, and these are all the guys. And after the collapse, all the companies of the former Standard Toil accounted for 65% of the market. And the most important thing was that there was a need to compete with each other, since now all companies had their own finances, their own income expenses, their own management, and so on. But what is important, Rockefeller, one way or another, has shares in absolutely all companies. And even though they were now competing with each other, fighting for the market and all that, the final beneficiary remained the same. Johnny. And the power, along with the capital, remained in his hands. He just needed to act a little more veiled now. But the collapse of the company into its components, although unpleasant in itself, was still not the main problem for the oil industry. The main problem was one object that was about the size of a human fist. Here. The most important problem of the oil industry at that time. In 1879, Edison invents the light bulb. At first, it would be like a dick with him, but in the future of 10, 15, 20 years, the light bulb would completely destroy the kerosene lamp market, and Rockefeller understood that. And then, quite suddenly, cars begin to appear. And a few years later, Ford appears with its Module T and begins its expansion. Cars fill the streets, and Rockefeller realizes that this is his new market. This is it, you don't have to go far anywhere. And as it was 30 years ago with kerosene, what you just need to do, well, like a normal infrastructure to deliver goods to a person, and everything will fly into space. So here, we just need to make sure that people always have access to fuel, roughly speaking, around the corner, and it costs acceptable money. And Rockefeller was able to do something in access, and for cheap, like no one else. The first station for the sale of gasoline appeared before the collapse. Standard Oil in 1907 year. Then they opened another one, then another. But before the collapse of the company, the gas station network developed very slowly. Again, simply because the monopoly has no incentives to develop. There is money, there is a market, well, okay. But after the collapse of the Standard Toy Company, the daughters very quickly realize that the gas station network is a very good way to extract additional profit from the growing automotive world. I didn't rush. 10 years after the collapse of Standard Toil, in the 21st year, there were 12,000 gas stations in the States. And 8 years later, their number increased tenfold to 120,000 gas stations. Every company that was connected with oil in one way or another built its own gas stations. A fight just started for advantageous places near large transport arteries. And this is a huge network that brought huge profits, strengthened the oil industry more and more. Meanwhile, while the oil industry was developing, society was struggling with its big internal problem. Americans drank a lot. The scale was really serious. Alcohol was very cheap at that time, and the states had large agricultural areas, and everyone was drinking. 1910s and 20s. This is generally the era of bars, cabarets, and debauchery in the States. A great time. If I had a time machine, I would definitely drive to the 20s of the USA. But not everyone was satisfied with the eternally drunk citizens. And since the 19th century, the so-called anti-saloon movement has been appearing in the States. Saloon. This is such a bar from cowboy movies, where the doors opened very sharply like that. Well, like your ex. The anti-alcohol movement was nationwide, and there were representatives in every state. At the same time, it's funny that the brightest supporters of the prohibition of alcohol, these are pharmacists and pharmacists. They motivated it by the fact that the rations. For a fig, alcohol is harmful to you. Better take our tonic tinctures with decoctions of herbs. There's no alcohol in them, but neither are they. Very good in a row, you know. Do you know what these tinctures were made of? From cocaine. Meet John Stith Pemberton. That's the dude's last name. The inventor of Coca-Cola, one of the brightest representatives of the anti-saloon movement. And Coca-Cola, let me remind you, was made from coca leaves at that time, and one jar accounted for about half a track of cocaine. And in all seriousness, John is like this, guys. Guys, why do you need to drink? It's also harmful and boring. I drank 2 cans for breakfast 3 days ago. I still can't sleep. In addition to pharmacists, the church, of course, opposed everything bad. America is generally a very religious country, especially at that time. And if some issue in the States somehow interfered with the church, then it was impossible to just disown these guys. The church then had a very large congregation, and almost all citizens were required to slap on sermons on Sundays. And there the priests poured them about the fact that alcohol, it's all from the devil, that you all have to be sober ulcers, and if you take a little sip, then you'll take something else in hell later. In short, by 1910, the movement gained such strength that it had serious political weight. Among the activists were politicians from both ruling parties, and church ministers, and entrepreneurs, and doctors, and everything in general. The alcohol industry did not believe until recently that it could simply be banned. Humanity has been thumping all its life, thumping, and, as we know from the experience of all dry laws, it will not stop thumping. And so, the drunk defended herself very sluggishly. And it was quite difficult to argue with a church person who promotes a sober lifestyle, or against activists who, like on a pitchfork, raised cases when a person lost his job there because of alcohol, left his family, and so on. Positive images of alcohol consumption, well, just can't be found. The industry couldn't come out and say, "This is Valera." Once Valera had a job, had a family. And there was a huge amount of worries. But then Valera discovered vodka. And he drank away his job, family, and a huge amount of worries. And now Valera is getting high. Valor, are you okay? Valor, are you okay, I say. You see, Valera is on mana. Be like Valera. The whole circus with horses was watched by the oil industry, and such. What now? The drunk will be banned, and we will have no competitor left. That's great news. Sounds like a toast. Your health, boys. That's the way it should be with this alcoholic. Yes, the government resisted the onslaught for some time, since after all, excise taxes on alcohol are quite a large part of the Treasury's income. But after a few years of pressure from the public, it gave up, of course. In the 1920th year, Prohibition comes into force and will be in effect until 1933. He meant a complete ban on the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol. And this is important to us because the law killed completely, and at the root, the idea that the DV will be able to drive on alcohol. Yes, during this period there was bootlegging. This is illegal production and sale of alcohol for underground bars. Well, that is like, there was alcohol. But no one wanted to get into trouble with the law just to fill up their car. It's easier to go to a petrol station, which everyone was happy to do. And if you explain all this long acceleration in one sentence, then Henry Ford gave the world an affordable car and a conveyor model. John Rockefeller gave the automotive world the infrastructure, and the US government made it so that only gasoline was available from fuel for internal combustion engines to ordinary citizens. And, as in the case of whale oil, people very quickly forgot about all alternatives to ice at the moment, when ice turned out to be the cheapest in the initial purchase, convenient and affordable from the point of view of infrastructure. But, as soon as all this infrastructure had volume, one non-obvious problem appeared. Although, it would seem, what are the problems? Well, like car sales are flying up, there are more and more manufacturers every day, and a large network of gas stations is growing by leaps and bounds. Money flows like a river, splendor. But, suddenly and unexpectedly, the oil ran out. Well, it's almost over. According to the forecasts of geologists and market experts, oil all over the world was supposed to run out in some kind of 15 or 20 years, about in the circus. Yes, all this howling that you and I have been living with all our lives, that oil is about to run out, but what are we going to do? And we urgently need to get off the oil needle. It appeared not at the end of the 20th century, but at the beginning, almost immediately, as a noticeable number of cars appeared in the world. And then, in the 20s, people were sure that another couple of decades, and that's it, there would be nothing to drive. You and I, it turns out, have been driving on the finished oil for 80 years. Think about it. At that time, the main oil production was carried out in the USA, in Pennsylvania, and in Venezuela. In Venezuela, by the way, production was conducted by the same standard of toil. This piece of the standard will then become an X. Huge oil reserves in Texas had not yet been discovered at that time, and the proven reserves would have been enough until about the 40s. All the oil companies invested a lot of money in the exploration of new fields, but they did not give results. Moreover, according to the experience of the First World War, all states understood that it is elementary unsafe to live without reliable fuel reserves, since all military equipment needs fuel. And if you don't have fuel, you have no military equipment, and you are defenseless in case of anything. And there was no solution. Everyone was worried and just hoped that someone would come up with something. By the early 30s, the oil situation was a real problem. Firstly, no one could imagine life without cars because they have become part of everyday life, and more importantly, have become part of the economy. If the government, automobile concerns, and oilmen had allowed that the oil had dried up, then everything would have been covered. From economics to energy. Cars drove on oil and its products, and this is the movement of all people and goods back and forth. Also, many industries worked on it, where manual labor was replaced by internal combustion engines, and a lot of elementary power plants and heating of houses worked on oil products. If the oil had run out, not just cars would have stopped rolling back and forth, but everything would have been covered, the whole way of life. And when the situation is facing the authorities and automakers in such an edge, that either we will solve it, or we are all finished, then ecology, good around the world, and other sentiments are the last thing you will be interested in. I needed a solution, and I don't care at what cost. In the USA, there is such a thing called the Institute of Petroleum in the USA. In fact, this is a shop organized by oil companies to represent their interests at the state level. As soon as an industry becomes too big a part of the economy and makes a big profit, the state immediately has a completely normal desire to get more control in this industry, regulate everything there properly, and also collect more taxes from where. Quite a normal desire. And the industry, in turn, is interested in maximum profit, maximum freedom, and maximum opportunities for itself. And usually such organizations are created by the state. But the US Petroleum Institute, abbreviated API, is the only non-governmental organization of its kind in the States. It was made with the filing of private companies and the hands of the same private companies. In addition to the state, the oil industry was constantly pressed by automakers, as they believed that because of the poor quality of fuel on their cars, the engines were falling apart faster. On alcohol, they drove noticeably better and longer at that time. Well, in order to protect themselves from such things, the industry gathered and made a separate organization that will sort out all this hemorrhoids. We collected a penny from all the companies, formed the organization's budget of several $1 million, and said, sort it out there. We went to earn money, and the institute was given the supervision of geologists who were engaged in the search for deposits. And geologists did not find new deposits and were sure that the oil would soon run out. There were two main problems that the institute needed to solve right here and now. The first, what to do with the running out of oil. The second, still, we need to figure out who is to blame for the falling apart engines. Oil workers, in response to all the claims of the automotive industry about bad gasoline, said that they simply do not know how to make those engines, so they fall apart, of course. The controversy of the format "you are shit, no oh, you shit" has never led to anything good. And fortunately people understood this. And they also understood that the truth most likely lies somewhere in the middle, and the gasoline is bad, and the engines are so-so. The most important thing that the Oil Institute has done in this matter is to create a platform and an atmosphere for discussion and dialogue. Representatives of the two industries constantly gathered at a round table and discussed all the issues of concern to them. And when conditions are created in which people can negotiate and think about a joint solution to the situation, they will definitely come up with something. And oddly enough, the solution for the second issue with gasoline and falling apart engines was invented by a man from the automotive industry. Meet Charles Kettering. And some of you are now like, wait, I've already seen this face somewhere. And yes, that's right, if you thought so, then you passed the mindfulness test. Hold the kiss. Charles Kettering is the man who invented the electric starter. At that time, he was the head of the development department at GEM. Remember, I said that GEM bought out Delca, the company that Catherine founded when he invented the electric starter. So, he bought it together with Kettering. For Charles, this was generally an ideal state of affairs, since he was a real inventor, and he didn't need to create businesses, manage companies like that. He just wanted to invent things, and it's quite difficult to refuse when GEM comes to you and says, take our development department and burn as you want, and we'll pay you a salary for it. In general, Kettering is one of the outstanding inventors of the USA. Throughout his life, he received 186 patents for his various inventions. Before his company Delco, he worked in telephone lines and invented a system by which a call came to a specific phone. Earlier, at the very dawn of the phone, if you called anywhere, then the phones rang all over the street. It was impossible to call someone in particular, you called the whole line at once. And Catherine solved this problem by being, well, like an ordinary employee of a telephone company. Think about it really, well, like before, if you call home, then at the same time you call the whole street.
Hello.
Beauty, connect me to all the women on this street.
And there's only a nursing home on this street.
Well, never mind, let's shake the old days. Then, Charles managed to work in the retail sector, in sales automation, and came up with an automatic cash register. You know that sound of the classic cash register, which is widely known, well, like in all American films. This is just the invention of Kettering. And then after that, he got into the automotive field, where he already came up with an electric starter, and a bunch of other useful things. In short, he was a brainy kid, that's what I mean. When he took up fuel, he had a hypothesis that two things were needed to save oil. The first, make a high-octane gasoline that will withstand a large compression ratio. The second is to make a motor that will work with a high compression ratio and not fall apart at the same time. And all this business together will reduce gasoline consumption while increasing the power and efficiency of engines. Roughly speaking, on the fingers here. But on these crooked fingers, how does it work? Here we all have at least an approximate idea of how the internal combustion engine works. The piston goes up from a low point, compressing the air and fuel that is in the cylinder. Having reached the maximum compression, that is, to the point where the piston stops, a spark hits the compressed fuel-air mixture, and the mixture begins to ignite. There is an expansion and release of energy, which, in fact, pushes the piston down, and the pistons, in turn, are screwed to the crankshaft, to the very metal thing that you and I know about, and transferring energy to this crankshaft, they turn it. Now carefully. You'll have to strain a little, but you can. If you have already bought out the fraud on the stock link from the previous history, then we are definitely able to figure out the compression ratio. This is the distance that the piston passes from the bottom to the top point, measured in centimeters. Let's say we have 10 centimeters. 10 centimeters is not a sin, as they say. Also, the distance that remains on top of the piston, in which the entire compressed mixture is located, is measured. And we will have, let's say, 1 centimeter. And the ratio of these two lengths is called the compression ratio. In our case, it will be 10:1. Now the question, with the same amount of fuel, in which case, when igniting this fuel, more energy will be released, at a compression ratio of 5:1, or at 10:1. We think. The correct answer is 10:1, since with this scheme you will compress more air. This gorenge occurs because of the air, and the more of it there will be, the more of them will burn, and the more energy we will get as a result. But there is a problem, that with a sharp and strong compression, our temperature increases. And here the question of gasoline characteristics already arises. What will happen to gasoline and air if it is compressed indefinitely? At some point it will just explode, and it will explode from the fact that if something is infinitely compressed, then the temperature will grow infinitely, and at a certain border, gasoline still explodes. Is that clear, I hope? Yes, nod. Well done. So, now we recall a typical gas station and pistols with numbers 92, 95, 98. Who is older can remember 80, 72. This figure is called the octane number, and the higher this figure, the more pressure and temperature gasoline can withstand without exploding. Caught it. The higher the figure, the more gasoline can be compressed. And the lower it is, the faster your gasoline will explode when compressed. This characteristic depends only on the quality of the gasoline itself, and on the additives that are added to it. If low-octane gasoline is poured into a high-compression engine, which cannot withstand a large compression ratio, then at the moment when the piston goes up and compresses the mixture, somewhere along the way, gasoline will begin to ignite and explode. From the explosion, you will have a small shock wave that will start hitting the piston and the cylinder wall, and the piston is still going up to meet it. And this kind of bullshit is called detonation. And this is one of the most important killers of all engines. If you pour low-octane fuel into a modern complex engine, the engine will collapse inside instantly. Therefore, the fuel type and geometric characteristics of the motor are a constant equation that automakers play. And to each motor, you have a recommendation that you need to fill gasoline here is not below such and such a border. Higher gasoline will withstand compression, and if lower, then hello to detonation and car service. I hope I explained it clearly. Nod if you get the point. Good girl. Hold the second kiss. The fact that you will be kissed in life, and for the fact that you understand what the compression ratio is. Nobody, only a painted man. So we'll kiss and talk about compression. About the back compression. The main problem was that gasoline of that time had an octane number of something there at the level of 50. And the industry did not want to make gasoline better because it would have to rebuild all the factories again, and this is expensive. It's much cheaper to say fuck off. And the industry did just that. Quite a budget solution. Therefore, the motors rattled loudly and fell apart due to detonation. Moreover, alcohol had a much higher compression ratio, and that is why cars then drove normally on it. But, do not forget, Prohibition. And Catherine is like me. I will solve this issue. There is a head, everything. I will definitely solve everything. This character worked with him in the laboratory. Thomas Midgley, a young chemist. They decided that it was possible to come up with an additive that could increase the octane number of fuel. And they started pouring everything they could get their hands on into gasoline and see what would come of it. At some point, they poured iodine into the gasoline, and the engine began to work really better on it. And the guys are like, oh, it's probably because iodine is red. The red color absorbs the temperature. And let's fill in the paint there. That's the level of knowledge of chemistry was at that time. Of course, even paint the color of the coldest ice did not reduce the temperature when the fuel was compressed. But this did not stop the guys, and they continued to have fun. At the same time, a shoe-in begins in the jam. The company suffered losses and lost the market to Ford due to the fact that William Durand indiscriminately bought everything that was not nailed down, spent money on it, and did not worry much about the effectiveness of these enterprises. Durand is kicked out of the company and replaced by Pierre Dupont, a well-known entrepreneur and crisis manager. He had a very clear and simple logic for a crisis manager. If something does not bring profit to the company, then it is worth getting rid of it. In general articles and expenses, he finds catering with his partner and calls them both to the carpet. The conversation was something like this: either you bring us something that we can make money on, or you bring a statement of your own. By that time, the only thing that worked in Midgley's experiments was alcohol. He himself drove a private car on a mixture consisting of 40% alcohol and 60% gasoline. Where were those 40%? In it or in the fuel? It is not specified. With pure gasoline, nothing really worked at all. And at the same time, even if Prohibition were abolished, it still wouldn't help the guys, since alcohol fuel cannot be patented. And accordingly, it is impossible to make money on it. And Dupont needed something that Jam could patent and sell to other concerns as his product, and ideally, the entire oil industry. Midgley was in a panic. Firstly, by the time of the beginning of the 20th year, development had already been going on for 5 years. The first experiments on this guy began back in 1915, and Thomas really wanted to find a solution. It is very difficult to give up when you are struggling for the 6th year in a row, to solve some problem here. Secondly, he had a lot of respect for catering and did not want to set him up because for a failure in work, first of all, he would get a hat for catering as a leader. All this pressure leads to the fact that Midge begins to experiment with toxic and low-toxic elements. And, lo and behold, the solution is found very quickly. That solution was lead. When adding just a few grams of lead to a whole gallon of gasoline, the detonation disappeared and the engine worked smoothly, quietly, did not lose power. Plus, lead is cheap. There is a lot of it in nature, and it is very understandable for production, since by that time, a lot of things were being made from it, such as water pipes, bullets, and also added to paint and whitewash. Midgley goes to the catering and says, "Look, this thing works perfectly, but I'm still worried about the fact that there is lead there, since it is purely potentially not very useful for health." Catering looks at the results, studies the data, and understands that this is what is needed. And even better, because it copes with detonation, and the additive is cheap to manufacture, and the formula can be patented. And the lead doesn't give a shit. Half of the country is painted with lead paint. It's not a big deal. In 1921st year, catering patents a lead additive to fuel called Tetraethyl lead, abbreviated TEL, and it had to be added in the proportion of half a gram per liter of fuel. Catering presents the development to the board of directors of JAM, as well as to the American Chemical Society. At the presentation, data were shown that the juice increases the octane number of fuel from 50 to 95, and significantly reduces its consumption. All by itself, delighted, congratulating each other, Catherine Key Midgley are happy, as they received recognition, and were finally able to solve the problem. The Chemical Society respects them so much, shakes hands and slaps them on the shoulder. And the management of the JAM is already sitting and counting the potential profit. According to their calculations, if they managed to take at least 1/5 of the fuel market, they would receive about $36 million of net profit for the year. And the market is growing. And the potential profit in the future there, for 10 or 15 years, generally flew into space. In 1923, the first tank of lead gasoline goes on sale. And a few months later, JAM and Standard Oil open a joint production of lead gasoline, which was called ethyl, which will supply fuel to gas stations all over America. Of course, catering is put on the post of president of the plant, and Midgley is put on the vice president. Success, joy, fireworks. But in the general bacchanalia, no one noticed the tiny voices of specialists from Yale and Harvard universities who wrote reports that lead was dangerous. And they had a case when one of the graduate students died of poisoning during experiments with lead. And Thomas Midgley, the author of the additive, could not personally collect his award from the American Chemical Society, as he was on sick leave with an eating disorder, abnormally low body temperature, and low blood pressure. Misha also had acute lead poisoning. Even before the headlines in the newspapers about the successful opening of the ethyl plant had passed, the production faced strange problems with employees. Sometimes one of the people started behaving strangely. Abnormally often, more often than at other oil refineries, people asked for sick leave. And someone stopped going to work altogether and disappeared. Midgley, the inventor of bodies and vice president of the plant, as soon as he got back on his feet after his illness, immediately flies to the plant and begins to understand what is happening there. And literally the following happened. During the 23rd, in the year when the plant was opened, several people died of dehydration and general body disorder at home, and several dozen workers went to a mental hospital. And those people who still worked at the factory walked somehow unsteadily, uncertainly, and in general behaved strangely. And Midgley is like that. So, it seems we're killing people here. Yes, another one fell. We're definitely killing people. And I haven't reached the factory yet. People have known for a long time that lead is toxic. Chemists throughout modern history have been constantly experimenting on it, because it's just fucking in nature. And everyone knew perfectly well that if you mix anything with lead and pour it on something, then you will not envy this something. And if you also inhale in pairs, then you can leave at all. For those who now have a brain crunching from the fact that metal can be poured somewhere there, and also inhale it, I will explain. Tetraethyl lead is a volatile liquid. A volatile liquid is any liquid that quickly evaporates. Here, roughly speaking, what will happen to you if you make a hookah on wine, for example? You'll be in the shit after a few puffs. That's understandable. And why will it be so? Because alcohol is a volatile liquid, it evaporates very easily, and alcohol vapors are instantly absorbed into the blood through the lungs. Since your lungs exist just so that oxygen is instantly and directly absorbed into the blood, and the blood, in turn, saturated with alcohol vapors, flies all over the body at once, and you instantly go to shit. When you drink alcohol, it enters your bloodstream through the gastrointestinal tract, is filtered by internal organs, liver and all this, and through the lungs, you have a direct injection into the blood. And so tetraethyl lead is exactly the same volatile bullshit as alcohol, only it consists of ethyl chloride, lead and sodium. If you mix these three pieces in certain proportions, you will get a liquid. And, if there is still a crunch in my head from the fact that metal can be mixed or dissolved with something, one more little remark. Remember chemistry at school? I know you probably didn't love her, but do you at least remember that you had her? Well done. Do you remember the name hydrochloric acid? Now someone who couldn't stand chemistry at school caught such a Vietnamese flashback. Whoa, stay there, I'm with you. In short, hydrochloric acid. It's already chlorine. You can buy this stuff on every corner absolutely. But if you throw aluminum into it, just a piece of metal, then it will dissolve. At the same time, the hydrogen that will be in the acid will dump in the form of bubbles. And you will have aluminum chloride in the test tube. Goo, goo. And there's a whole bar of metal there. In short, we caught the essence, I hope. Caught it. Nod. Well done. Hold the third kiss. Tetraethyl lead is obtained by the interaction of ethyl chloride and an alloy of lead with sodium. Neither one, nor the other, nor the third will be useful to you inside the body, believe me. During the reaction, sodium and chlorine evaporate, and only as much remains. Hydrogen. S. Carbon. And me? Your mouth. No, there's lead instead of me. And as a result, it is a volatile liquid that evaporates very well, and lead naturally flies in the air. And with sufficient ingress of vapors into a person, tetraethyl lead primarily affects the brain and the entire nervous system. Absolutely everything where there are nerve endings, instantly hello. And the nerve ending spoiler, you have absolutely everywhere. The only organ in a person that doesn't have nerve endings is your ex's heart. The psyche is disturbed, a strong weakness appears in the body, and in general, the whole body begins to move away, since absolutely all processes inside are disrupted. But we know that now. But at that moment, everyone knew that lead, it seems, is not useful, but in general, it will roll, it's not scary. But the most important thing is that Mijili knew about the danger of his invention. He felt firsthand what poisoning of bodies is. Therefore, he was initially not sure that this additive should be put into production at all. And when people naturally started leaving his factory, he realized that it was all his responsibility. He resorts to catering and such. Peasants. The peasants, my lord, are dying like flies. There is no one left, neither flies nor peasants. And if you and I get caught for this, do you know what else will not happen? Our anal virginity. Although what are we worried about this? We all remember the summer of '87. Kidron calms him down and sells him the idea that a lot of people work with toxic elements. No one has people die in droves at the factories. It's just a matter of safety. We need to train the workers properly, and everything will be cheeky-pukey breeky ricky tiki tavi. Jam is the same. They also have all the regulatory documentation written this way. I just can't explain the existence of Chevrolet Cruze in any other way. In short, catering calmed Midgley down and said he would look into the matter. Although, in fact, all that catering did was hire another chemist, Robert K., this dude, and set him the task of making the production of the body safe. Well, also, to carry out all the necessary training work of the employee. K. said his confident aha and went to sort it out. But the real problem for the whole plant was not the deaths themselves as such, but the fact that the press got wind of them. Because right there, instantly, headlines like the unknown gas format appear in all large publications, driving people crazy. An unknown poison kills workers at the ethyl plant. People are going crazy at the ethyl plant. And who is responsible for the death of workers at the ethyl plant in front of their families? And in the next 24th year, 2 more employees died right at work, plus a batch of several dozen went to a mental hospital. And according to unconfirmed press reports, there are several more employees who quietly killed themselves at home. The press tore apart the ethyl, jam, and Standard Oil plant. Jam and Standards were stupidly silent, but Kettering still sometimes went out to the press to answer questions. And it would have been better if he hadn't done it. For example, at one of the press conferences, which was held immediately after another death at work, when asked why an employee at the factory died, Catherine replied, "He probably worked a lot." And naturally, with such comments, he provoked more and more waves of hate. The scandal unfolded to such a scale that it simply could not be ignored, even at the government level. The American Health Association, together with government officials, slows down the plant and calls the management to the carpet. Under the pretext of "what have you done there?" Ethel sensibly decided that it was not worth sending Catering to explain to the guys outside the bazaar. Otherwise he would blurt out something in the spirit of "we were all born to die. And that's it. You can go and pack your bags and go to the labor exchange." And that's why Robert K. was sent there, to speak with words through his mouth. And the Commission Keha Terrace is just great. Firstly, he said that everything here is still experimental, we are only making the first batches. And since the tell thing is new, we ourselves will now understand how to produce it better. And everything will be fine. We are not worried about safety. We will monitor, everything will be fine. And secondly, Keha's like this, do you have evidence that people died from the bodies? Yes, the fact that there's a dead man lying here is a fact, I don't argue. But people die from a lot of things. His wife recently bought an Opel from him. Maybe that's not why the engine got up. And you will be closing the factory for us here. That's when you will have proof on your hands that people are dying from Tetraethyl lead. Then will you cover something for us? If you want to ban us, first prove it. In the meantime, we tell you that the body is safe, since there is no evidence to the contrary. And it rolled in. The Health Association was going to deal with the leadership for 3 days, but on the first day after K's speech, the commission left and allowed work for water, since they still had no real evidence on hand. And the fact that people were worried and whispering there, because of the news headlines, it was not an argument to close the plant. But Keha not only knew how to scratch his tongue, but also worked very hard and efficiently. He began to investigate absolutely all deaths at the enterprise, interview the sick there, all the victims, monitor all work processes and measure the level of gas contamination of all premises there, and so on. And wherever he found danger, he immediately corrected this moment. Firstly, he redesigned absolutely all the ventilation in the production, and also installed fans in each workshop. Secondly, he developed and implemented a special form of clothing that protected the skin from contact with chemicals. Thirdly, he introduced a system of mandatory training of employees before admitting them to production. In fact, Keha simply introduced a normal safety technique and forced all employees to comply with it. For the modern world, this is the norm, but then not every company thought that an employee could harm himself in the workplace. Plus, Keha beat out of Gemma the standard royal budget for the construction and creation of a laboratory that will study the effect of TELP on the human body and, in general, will conduct research on toxic substances. Corporations, of course, gladly allocated money to the person who did not allow their plant to close, but with one condition, that all materials and articles that the laboratory will produce before publication will be studied by specialists of General Motors and Standard Val. And the most important thing is that GEM and Standard specialists can make edits and comments to the materials, and the decision to publish these materials remains with corporations. And in fact, this means that lawyers and managers of GEM and Standard companies decided for themselves what to publish from their research and what to classify and not show to anyone. In general, the secrecy of all Protel materials was from the very beginning. The management of the concerns did not use the words TEL, toxin, lead in personal correspondence, and any official documents. All internal materials of laboratories, negotiations, meetings, and everything related to the body were declassified only recently. And from what has recently been made public, there is a mention that just a few days before the conference with the American Health Association, Catherine, along with several lawyers from GEM and Standard, paid a personal visit to the head of the association. It is not known what they were talking about there. Well, we hardly discussed the weather. Meanwhile, the Ke laboratory came with the first results, which showed that the elevated level of lead in the blood was absolutely every employee of the plant. And it does not matter whether he worked directly with the Stell or swept the territory of neighboring workshops. Even those workers who never touched the body at all had lead in their blood, up to a dick and more. And from this study, Tech concludes that lead, it is a natural element in human blood. It's in everyone's blood, at all. Well, that's great, so that's where he should be. And fuck, that we didn't take people in our study who don't work for us. We won't talk about it. This is an error that can be ignored. Logic and objectivity. The second conclusion, since it's lead, a normal element in the blood, then it should have a norm. Let it be 80 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. Why? That dick knows, I just like the number. Really, the rationale was just like that. And from this figure, it followed that if a person has 79 milligrams in his blood, then everything is fine with him. And if 81, then it's an ass, and something needs to be done. It was with these two statements that Keha came out to politicians, healthcare professionals, and the public, however, to all these guys. That lead is normal, that's the norm for you, and our workers have it less. Are there any arguments against it? And there were no arguments against it. No one had any data on lead, and by and large, no one cared. The public calmed down, well, okay, and the production of tetraethyl continued. And in just a few years, leaded gasoline will be at every gas station in the United States, and then all over the world. From a global point of view, ethyl gasoline was a good thing for the entire oil industry, since it still reduced gasoline consumption on the car due to more correct combustion, and allowed saving oil which was running out. I remind you, the situation with new deposits did not move in any way. In general, from the time of 1919, when the Institute of Petroleum was founded there, to 1923-24, when leaded gasoline actually appeared. New deposits with sufficient oil reserves were simply not found. How did they find them from 1924 to 1930? Pennsylvania and other states were digging, but all that could be found were small deposits that could delay the issue for a couple of years. And Standard Oil didn't have a solution. By Standard Oil, I mean all the companies into which it has collapsed. Although all the shops were called differently, the essence is the same and the beneficiary is the same. But in 1933, a bell rings in one of the company's offices. The person who called was Carl Trichel, and he was well acquainted with the management of various points of the Standard. Carl called Lloyd Hamilton, this guy, one of Standard Oil's top lawyers. On the phone, Carl told him something like this. I don't care what your plans are, you're dropping everything now, taking a suitcase, getting on a damn plane, and flying to me. Lloyd, of course, was a little taken aback by this formulation of the question, but asked, where, in fact, to fly? The answer was, to Saudi Arabia. The first thing that comes to mind when mentioning the first half of the 20th century is two world wars, in which almost the entire planet participated. And in addition to the mountain of corpses and destroyed human lives, these two wars have quite noticeably changed the borders of states. Somewhere someone seized new territories, somewhere colonies rebelled and were freed from the control of the empire. And someone with a handful of countries or regions united into one big country. That's how Saudi Arabia appeared, through the unification of the regions. There were 4 regions on the Arabian Peninsula. These are Najd, Hijaz, El Hassa, and Qatif. In 1932, they unite into a single country and call themselves, in fact, Saudi Arabia. This person, Abdul Aziz II, became the head of the newly minted state. In Russian, this is Abdul Aziz ibn Abdurrahman ibn Faisal al-Saud. Damn, it's probably fun to be the head of Saudi Arabia. You come in, you're all in a sheet, you have a harem, a hookah and smoke. A real tiger. One of you might think. A tiger, of course, is a tiger, But we need to explain what Saudi Arabia looked like in 1932. It looked something like this. And you won't even have crickets there, we planted it. All you have there is sand, camels and Arabians. Not Aryans, please note. A very important clarification, in the 30s and 40s of the 20th century. With a detailed and very careful examination of the landscape, you can notice a problem: there is no water. There is such a property in the desert, that there is no water there. And the human body has such a property, that it cannot do without water. Even if the politicians came out with a statement that we need to tighten our belts, we need to be patient a little. Now is not the time to drink water, so we will build communism and then. I'm kidding here, of course, but the question was really acute. There is no water of its own, no rains are expected, and Arabia could not afford to buy water, simply because there is no money. It is now in the modern world, every second resident in Saudi Arabia. This is a Ukrainian escort girl, a very important marker of well-being, and then there was no money at all. The government understood that they could not solve the problem here on their own, since there were no specialists, no money, no time. There was only a hypothesis that there was water in the desert, and there are very high hopes for this. In addition to sand, there were rocky areas in the desert, and this gave little hope that underground water could be dug up somewhere. For this issue, the government has invited this dude, Carl Twitchell, an expert in geology and an experienced driller. He agreed to help, assembled an expedition in the 33rd year, and went into the desert to take soil samples and poke around in every hole he could find there. They didn't find any water there, but wherever Carl started taking samples, he always came across signs of oil. After returning from the expedition, he told Abdulaziz something like this: "Boss, I knows what you will drink, but it seems I know what you will sell. But I need help. I won't take one out. I have a couple of friends here, let me make a few calls, and we'll solve everything in the best possible way." And at this point, Carl calls the management of Standard Well and says that we need to drop everything and fly here. As soon as the bosses from the oil industry realized that it smells fried, they immediately offered their help in Saudi Arabia. In the exploration of the area, they say, "We are all so noble, we want to help you with exploration, field development. Of course, we will take care of all the costs. You don't need to worry about anything at all, our dear Abdulaziz ibn Abdurrahman, ibn Felsalat, or whatever your name is." The Saudi government understood that the West needed oil and fuel, but had no idea how to extract it, how to process it, how much it needed, how much it could cost in investments, and so on. They understood camels perfectly, in one-humped, two-humped, in which, but in oil, not a tooth with a foot. And it is very difficult to refuse when the kind Standard Oil arrives in a crowd, says with a big smile, that we are all here, and now we will organize, but we will pay everything, don't worry. Here's your hookah, please. And there was no point in refusing. You could, of course, send everyone to fuck, but you still don't have your own money for development. There was nothing to do. In short, we agreed on what? Standard Oil assumes all the costs of exploration, development, construction of enterprises, laying of pipelines, and gets the opportunity to extract oil. But still, this field belongs to Saudi Arabia, so the company will pay a tax to the treasury from each barrel of oil produced. In fact, Saudi Arabia simply received a net profit in the form of taxes to its budget, and could already solve its internal problems with this money. Buy water, pour it into a hookah, and, in general, posh. In the 39th year, the grand opening of the first oil pipeline took place. Fuck, how happy everyone is. And not only that, in principle, America really needed oil for its industry. The Second World War begins in the same year, and the demand for fuel and energy is only increasing. And with this, the construction of more and more plants is accelerating, since there were much more deposits than everyone initially thought. And not only in Saudi Arabia, but throughout the region. For 20 years, from the 40s to the 60s, mining has been unfolding throughout the Middle East, and the ball is ruled by the so-called Seven Sisters. These are Tesson, Rolduc Shell, Texaco, Chevron, Mobil, Gulf Oil, and British Petroleum. And what is important is that all of them, this is the former Standard Oil, and always the development and production was carried out on the same conditions. We do everything ourselves, we just pay you the tax. Moreover, the tax was paid based on the price of a barrel of oil. And due to the fact that the production volumes were huge, oil turned out to be much cheaper for corporations than their own, even taking into account delivery to the United States. And the sisters produced 80% of all oil in the Middle East. But even this was not enough for them. Corporations negotiated among themselves and deliberately restrained the price of oil in order to pay as little taxes as possible. In fact, what happened? They bought oil from themselves for their own refineries. And the low price of oil suits you quite well if you still earn 3 ways later on gasoline and other products that you get from oil. But you will pay little taxes for the countries on whose territory you extract oil. Profit. But such a situation did not suit the government of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait in any way. These are all the guys. They called Venezuela to them, scored a hookah, and were like, guys, we need to cough up the question somehow. We get everything here, earn it. We also earn money, but somehow I would like more. What do you think? They estimated that 65% of all known world oil reserves are located on their territory in total. For comparison, in Russia, for example, something about 5% of the total known reserves. And the guys decided that they were teaming up with the slogan brother for brother, so it was taken as a basis. And they will say on one front that we are raising the price of oil and thread. Either you agree, or go fuck yourself. Over there is our Kalashnikov dump truck per column as an argument. This is how OPEC appeared. That's how this thing stands for. Organization of Oil Exporters in Russian. Initially, it consisted only of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela. And then, the United Arab Emirates, which is a separate country, if anything, Algeria, Qatar, and Indonesia, also pulled up to the guys. And this is almost 75% of all known oil on the planet. When the OPEC countries came out with the fact that now there is no other way, the United States and Europe had no choice but to agree and recognize OPEC as a full-fledged organization to be reckoned with. It was in the 60th year. For several years, OPEC has not only taken control of the price of oil into its own hands, but they are also starting to decide which country, what volume they will supply. And they felt their strength in it. But if you look at the oil price chart, you can see that in the 60s, the situation did not change much somehow. Yes, oil there was $1 more expensive, then $1 cheaper, then nothing significant. But in the 73rd year, the schedule flies into space. And here's why. In the 73rd year, the Arabs have a conflict with Israel. They are there, as it were, constantly killing each other, raping each other. Everyone is used to it, nothing new. But after 2 world wars, the world was globally so shocked by what it had done that it decided not to allow such things anymore. And all serious countries sat down, thought, and created it, the United Nations. He is such a circus with horses, which is for all the good in this world, and against all the bad. If suddenly something happens in the world that, according to the UN, is unfair or dangerous, they immediately intervene and put a lookout there. When a conflict happens, it's not enough that the whole of Europe and he are like, the Arabs are wrong here. We thought about it and decided that the Jews are great. Go Jutes, as they say. So, the United States also began to ship weapons to Israel under the guise of humanitarian aid. Sheiks look at the whole thing and such. Leo, dear performers, salam alaikum. The Jewish kebab is our ancient sheik tradition, which should not be violated in any case. If they are so smart, we will limit oil supplies. Everyone, leave the hookah. Is that gas? And Europe and America are like that at this moment. That is, they are fighting there, we are the extreme ones. We can't even do anything, but at the same time, there is a very strange taste in the mouth. Yes. That's who. A natural panic began. All production, energy, and in general, the economies of developed countries at that time were based only on oil. And when you realize that restrictions are imposed on the resource on which everything is kept at all, then what will you do? That's right, you'll buy as much as you can for the future, in order to somehow delay the economic ass. And as we already know, if there is a panic demand for some product, then what does it do? Soaring in price, of course. And the sheiks in hookah bars are like this, bro, there's a second one here. Now we can afford it. Not only did countries run wild to buy up everything that wasn't nailed down, but a wave of super stupid restrictions flew through Europe and the USA. In Britain, for example, air traffic was closed Car trips were banned on weekends and holidays, and the Prime Minister of England very much asked citizens to heat only one bedroom, and not the whole house. In Italy and Germany, the demand and prices for bicycles have sharply increased, and because of the shortage in Italy, a black bicycle market has even appeared. If it was possible to earn more on bicycles than on cocaine, then okay, so be it, and the mafia will take on this sin of spreading the infection. In Holland, they were imprisoned for exceeding the energy limit for one room. And in France, people were fined if the temperature in the house exceeded 20 degrees. There were no such harsh measures in America. It's just that 20% of the gas stations didn't have a drop of fuel. And if your number ended with an even digit, then you could refuel only on the honorable days of the month. The rest refueled at odd times. But the most important thing was that in fact, the OPEC countries reduced supplies by only 7%. Oil was supplied as well as supplied, just everything was transferred out of fear. And this global crisis was provoked simply by words. Words through the mouth. A group of people with eggs said we won't give you oil, and everyone ran in a panic to die and hang themselves. The oil crisis of 1973. This is the first situation in the world when it became obvious to everyone that in order to influence countries, to make half the world dance to your tune, you don't need missiles, you don't need a huge army of fanatics, and you don't even have to get up from a chair. It is enough to own resources and have a weighty amount of eggs to take advantage of this. And starting from the moment of 1973, oil simply turns from black slush into something that can give you power. Both oil and all its products are becoming a very serious lever of political pressure, which the whole world had to reckon with. No matter what anyone says, there is no absolute freedom, both at the level of an individual and at the level of states. Of course, all such people there strive for maximum freedom so as not to depend on anyone, to dictate their own rules. But no, there is no oil of its own in Europe as a phenomenon. And in any case, they are dependent on OPEC countries and gas suppliers like Russia, no matter how progressive and developed they would be. And the crisis of the 73rd year clearly showed this. And what logical conclusion will you make when you catch such a joke with limited supplies and global panic in the country? What do I need to look for alternative energy sources? Of course. But it seemed to me that dry pragmatism alone is not enough here for everyone to suddenly take care of alternative energy sources. And ecology. What does ecology have to do with it? At that time, no one thought at all. But now ecology is the main argument for abandoning hydrocarbons. The fact that Europe has realized its dependence is Oklahoma. This fact will still be useful to us. But, what a macker, everyone took care of the environment, and that the car is the main enemy of clean air. And it all started, as it usually happens, with one screwed-up geek. While the expansion of American oil companies to the Middle East was unfolding in the 50s, one geek was sitting in one of the laboratories in the States and picking at a meteorite. A real scientist who has nothing behind his soul but science, and in his head too, there is nothing but science. The name of this character was Claire Patterson, one of the most talented geophysicists of the 20th century. By the time of the 53rd year, he was already a world-famous scientist, since he was one of the co-authors of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Japan. After he saw what his work on weapons had led to, he decided that he would never work in this field again. And I decided to do something peaceful. Namely, he decided to find out the age of the Earth. In the middle of the 20th century, no one knew exactly how old the Earth was as a planet. But Patterson had an idea how to figure this out. And for this, he needed mass spectral analysis. Why am I telling all this at all? And what is it? I'll explain now, don't worry. But imagine, you are a scientist, and someone comes to you, brings a stone with him, and says, tell me what it is, what elements it consists of, and how many grams of what element is there. Is that what you're going to do? Oh, fig it, this is understandable, but it is necessary to somehow calculate what, and in what proportions the stone consists of. Why, in principle, to find out what a piece of rock consists of, I think, is understandable. Well, like at least to look for various deposits, for example. Well, or just for fun. It's no good doing that. People do that sometimes. And if you use to understand how to understand what something is made of, then now you can shove the rock into a special device, and it will tell you everything. On what principle are such devices based? They take an ion cannon, shoot at an object with ions, and then look where they have arrived. And depending on the material of the object, the trajectory of the ion will be different. Remember this bullshit from school, that every molecule consists of atoms. There are positive, negative, that's all. So, for each substance, molecules have their own unique magnetic field. And knowing how the ions deviate from the trajectory, from the magnetic field of each element, it is possible to analyze various objects for its composition. Perhaps one of the scientists or people of science will now be a little worried about such an explanation. But I am deliberately simplifying, since the nuances and details are not important to us here. It's important to know that Patterson was having fun with these things. Patterson believed that meteorites. This is the residual material from the formation of the solar system. That's when the Big Bang happened. That's when it's all about space and flying with the planets. And if you calculate the age of the meteorite, then you can understand the age of the Earth, since they should be there plus or minus the weather. Well, they studied in one school there, that's all. And the age of the meteorite can be understood by the amount of uranium in it. Uranium, as an element, decays into lead over time. And here it is the word we need. If you understand the ratio of uranium to lead in an object, then you can calculate its age through a special equation. As soon as Patterson put it in his head that it was possible to calculate the age of the Earth in such a way, he immediately went to the nearest meteorite, for a meteorite, dragged it to his laboratory, and let's have fun. The first thing he needed to do was get a clean sample of the meteorite. Because while he flew to our planet, while he was lying somewhere in the field, while he was transported to the laboratory, a lot of shit stuck to him. And of course, it was necessary to clean it from this shit so that the experiment was accurate. But in the first experiment, Claire rested on the fact that there was too much lead. The values were simply scaled. And he's like, well, there's probably something left from previous research. Wash your lab. He washed the walls, wiped all the equipment, all the jars, and treated the bottles with distilled water. Conducts the experiment again, and no result. Cohen lead. Lead oozed from literally every crack. It was everywhere, on the skin, on clothes, and even in the tap water. And that's when Claire realizes that this is at least strange bullshit. He disinfected his entire laboratory with chemical solution, installed ventilation air pumps, covered everything with polyethylene, and he worked in a mask, in a bathrobe, and wrapped himself in a film on top. But there was still too much lead. And this did not allow him to conduct an experiment. No matter what he did, no matter how he tried to achieve sterility, nothing worked for him. I must say that in the 50s, no one really worked on sterility in laboratories. Well, like I put on gloves, and that's it, well done. That's why everyone was looking at Patterson. It was a lot strange when he made his room and costumes out of a garbage bag. But Patterson was a stubborn guy. And if you methodically hammer at one point for a long time, then you should definitely get something. It took him 5 years to build his first sterile laboratory, and eventually still get a clean piece of meteorite, without impurities that could stick to it from above. Then, he spent another 3 years building a new laboratory to conduct experiments with spectral analysis, since the previous one simply did not fit the equipment. And in the 56th year, after 8 years of cleaning the premises and studying the meteorite, he completes his research. And the result is that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Applause, recognition, awards. But Patterson was no longer up to it. He wanted to understand what the fuck was going on with lead, and why there was so much of it everywhere. Just so you understand what he had in the lab. The first one, ordinary clothing, was banned as a phenomenon. All the laboratory assistants, and he himself, went in special suits. Second, in the building, absolutely all ventilation was redesigned in such a way that the laboratory was completely sealed, but at the same time, there was special aerodynamic equipment in the ventilation that supplied air purified from all impurities. Third, all the wiring was replaced in the laboratory, since it had lead solder on it at that time. And the fourth, all the surfaces of the room were washed with special chemical solutions several times a day. Patterson did not let anyone into the building, saying that if someone came from the street and just walked into the room, he would bring so much lead with him on his hair that he would need to wash all the rooms for several days. And why this was happening, Claire did not understand. More precisely, he did not understand whether this was normal or not. Has it always been the case that there is so much lead around, and now we have just noticed it, because spectral equipment has appeared? Or is it some new process on the planet? And I must say that any research costs money. At the same time, quite a lot of money. And Patterson, of course, didn't have any. For example, he received a budget study of a meteorite from the Atomic Energy Commission when he told them that his developments would help in the creation of uranium fuel. This was a lie of pure water, as Patterson himself later said, but he did not hesitate to beat out budgets with such methods. He studied uranium. Uranium. Is there uranium in uranium fuel? There is. Well, that's all you've dug up. So he thought that the picture of lead can be checked with this marker. You can equip an expedition into the ocean, collect samples from various depths and layers of the world ocean, and compare the lead content in all of them. And if the lead is the same everywhere to fuck, then you can relax. So, this is a normal phenomenon. He came to representatives of the oil industry and said that with his research, he could find new oil deposits in the ocean. They say that we will find traces of oil somewhere in the water layers, and it will be possible to dig there. The guys happily paid him $200,000, and Patterson went on an expedition. In total, the expedition traveled from the Pacific Ocean to the Sargar Sea, and samples were taken from all reservoirs along the way. On his return, of course, he locks himself in his plastic bag again and sits down for samples. And at this point, his hair begins to move on his ass. The samples taken near the surface had an average of 20 times more lead than deep-sea samples. And this means that lead has appeared recently. He began to study volcanic eruptions, their like, and similar natural disasters, in order to find at least some logic, where only lead has come from in the last 100 years. But there was no logic. All the cataclysms were local, and the lead was evenly fucking everywhere. And quite by chance, in his search, he stumbles upon some report of the oil industry about the next successful and huge volumes of production and sale of lead gasoline. And at this moment, he fuses the picture. It's all because of those third lead. And without asking anyone anything, he writes a detailed report about his studies of the meteorite, the ocean, and how much lead is everywhere, and that this is precisely because of people, or rather because of the oil industry, and publishes it in scientific publications. The Oil Institute is infuriated. Not only did Patterson warn no one and show nothing to anyone, he poured shit on them at their own expense. After all, they gave him money for ocean research. Funding, of course, immediately stops, and people from the Oil Institute begin to put pressure on the leadership of the California Institute where Patterson worked. They say that they urgently stop his activities. But it was too late. The most important thing has already happened. The scientific community began to discuss the article on the sly, and everyone realized that this was a real problem along the way. When the oilmen realized that it was pointless to cut off finances, they decided to go the other way. They sent their lawyers and representatives to Patterson to talk him into doing something else there. Well, look, dear ones, we have money, we can finance anything. If you want, at least the train will bring you plastic bags, then don't get involved with us, please. But all the guys got was a lecture about how harmful lead is. And they left with nothing. The Oil Institute didn't know what to do with this geek. He didn't have any business, and he didn't have any profitable patents either. And there was nothing to put pressure on him and threaten him with. He was just a stubborn geologist. After the whole oil industry collapsed on Patterson, he realized that he had to go all the way. He publishes another article where he criticizes the generally accepted standards for the content of lead in the human body. And personally, he attacks Robert Koch, who set the norm at 80 milligrams. Robert Koch, this is the guy who once told the Health Association that if you don't have proof that you're dangerous, then go fuck yourself. And who was also concurrently engaged in safety at factories and teal. I've told you about him before. And at the same time, Robert Koch by this moment, bend your fingers. Founder and head of the Department of Environmental Hygiene at the University of California, Chairman of the Commission of the American Association of Industrial Hygiene, President of the American Academy of Occupational Medicine, Deputy Chairman of the Council for Industrial Health, and Director of the Medical Department at the Teal plant concurrently. And of course, such a respected person in the scientific community looked at some scientist from the laboratory as a piece of clay on the soul. Here is his quote: "I consider the conclusions regarding the natural lead content in the human body to be extremely naive." This is an example of how wrong a person can be in his biological postulates and conclusions when he enters a field in which he is so ignorant that he does not even have any idea of the depth of his ignorance, and therefore is so careless in his radical conclusions. Haya, of course, was joined by all the famous toxicologists of that time. Let's hope that this article will be the first and last from the field of science fiction, said toxicologist Herbert Stockinger, one of the most famous characters at that time. A minor nuance was that all the people who criticized Patterson either worked at the Institute of Petroleum directly, or simply financed with oilmen. Such is a small minor nuance. And when all the mastodons of the scientific community, though paid, but with one voice, say that your articles, this is the nonsense of a madman, and in no case do not pay attention to them, then you have no chance to win. Although the whole truth of the world will be on your side, if you fail to reach people, there will be no result. No matter how stubborn you are, if no one listens to you, then you will not achieve results. And here was Patterson in such a situation, 100% sure of his rightness, and ignored by everyone. Fortunately, if Patterson learned anything while working on the sterility of his laboratory, it's that the result will be sooner or later anyway, if you work methodically, and under no circumstances give up. Everyone loves the stories of lone heroes who, with their stupid stubbornness, broke through any walls, went against the rules, and changed this world. But in reality, there are no singles. There is a society and people in it, and society, such a creature, is ready to accept only certain ideas at a certain time. If Patterson, for example, had taken care of his ecology in the 40s, no one would have listened to him, because everyone seemed to have no time for it. Everyone was engaged in other entertainment. Therefore, in order to understand why this or that idea was heard in a particular period of time, you need to understand the context of that time and what people were worried about at that time, what they were worried about and what they were talking about in the kitchens. And fortunately, lead. This is not the only question to the industry that worried scientists and the general public at that time. In 1948, in the small town of Donor, which is located in Pennsylvania, there was an incident that went down in history under the name Donor Smog. For 4 days, from the 27th to the 31st of October, the city was enveloped in dense smog. It seems to be nothing terrible. Fog happens in nature. But on the first day, it became clear that something was wrong. Local hospitals began to receive a lot of calls from people complaining of coughing and choking attacks. And by the evening, the whole city was in a panic, as absolutely everyone was suffocating. Those who had the opportunity, urgently gathered all their relatives and left the city, and the rest were left to suffocate at home. In appearance, the city literally died out, empty streets, cafes, shops, and only ambulances drove through the streets, and tried to save at least someone. This hell ended only because it rained on the 31st, on Sunday. The smog is gone, and it was in the zinc production plant, which was located nearby. There was a leak of fluorine gas, which killed all the vegetation on the territory of the plant, and also covered the city. And out of 14,000 people of the population, 6,000 fell ill, and 70 died in 4 days. December 4, 1952. London. The city is suddenly covered by an anticyclone, which makes it very cold and windless. People trying to keep warm start to drown their houses hard, and then they were heated overwhelmingly with coal. And coal emits sulfur when burning, especially if the coal is of a fig quality. Gorenge. And the British had just such a one. The fog covers the city very quickly, but no one pays attention to it. Well, like London. But it is quite difficult not to pay attention to the fact that 4,000 people died in the city in 2 days, and in 4 days, the death toll increased to 13,000. And about 25,000 more people were lying in hospitals and homes. And it all ended too, thanks to the rain, which nailed all the sulfur flying in the air to the ground. It seems this city needs a new superhero. And this kind of stuff happened here and there. Absolutely everywhere where large enterprises were located, people in the vicinity complained of general deterioration of health. Lung problems there, and quite often died. Medical scientists and climate scientists from all developed countries studied smog with might and main, which was, well, like a normal announcement in big cities. One of these guys, the Frenchman Eugene Goudry, calculated that from 1915 to 1950, the consumption of gasoline, coal and oil increased 25 times, and exactly 25 times the cases of lung cancer in residents of large cities have increased. And there were more and more similar studies every day. All this together leads to the fact that the governments of developed countries understand that, damn, something needs to be done about it. Since the USA had the most developed industry at that time, they had the most such excesses. And since the 50s are also the heyday of broadcasting, the whole country was aware that some bullshit was constantly happening somewhere near the factories. Previously, if something similar had happened to the donor city in Pennsylvania, then only residents of the donor city in Pennsylvania would have been aware of it. Even in a networked city, hardly anyone would have found out. And now, any joint became public. And of course, everyone was worried about this. And the most important thing is that people did not feel the protection of the state in these matters. And dissatisfied people. These are people who vote for the opposition. And something had to be done about it. The government gathered in 1955, scratched the turnip, and gave birth to the Air Pollution Control Act, which allowed scientists to conduct research at enterprises such as informing the population about possible dangers, and finding the causes of pollution, and thinking about ways to control them. The law did not introduce any emission standards. The only benefit that came from it was that scientists were given research budgets, and they began to slowly collect official data. Well, people were calmed down a little by the fact that everything is fine, we are engaged, we have nothing to worry about. A new round of concern about the environment was given by this book, Silent Spring, which appeared in 1963, 8 years after the Tact on Air Pollution Control. This book was published by activist and biologist Rachel Clarkson. She studied how plants, animals, and people are affected by pesticides, which most farmers have become very active in using. Pesticides. These are chemicals that are sprayed over beds for rodents, pests, and weeds, so that they simply do not devour the harvest. And the result of her research was a rather logical conclusion, that substances that kill insects, rodents, and small birds are not very useful for human health. The government did not control the agricultural sector in any way, just like the industry. Therefore, farmers could water their lands with whatever they wanted. In her book, Rachel focused on how chemicals affect the child's body. They affect the development of organs, the occurrence of chronic diseases, disorders in the nervous system, and so on. And if you want to hook people as much as possible, then there is no stronger trigger than children's health or a future for children. And in this book, there was both. The book instantly spread across the states and caused such a storm of indignation that no one expected. People began to take to the streets and organize actions with the slogan, "Stop poisoning our children," and to be en masse indignant about it. Plus, by this point, scientists who have been studying the air near enterprises have collected a fairly hefty amount of data that industry and cars emit harmful substances and solid particles into the air: sulfur, lead, nitrogen, and carbon. And since everything was fine with industry in the country, and 83 million cars were already riding on the roads by that time, there were really a lot of emissions. Now in Russia, for example, there are about 60 million cars, and in the States 60 years ago, there were 20 million more. And the United States is half the size of Russia in terms of area. Plus, we throw on the whole picture that in the 63rd year, John F. Kennedy, the beloved President of the people of America, was killed, and there were a lot of internal problems in the country. The atmosphere of total distrust and discontent hung right in the air. 65th year. This is the year of the United States participation in the Vietnam War, against which the entire young part of the population was living. And the 67th year. This is the year of the Detroit riot, when the black population defeated half of the city and suppressed the uprising with tanks. In short, it was fun. Politicians understood that control over society was slipping out of their hands, and it was not clear to anyone what to grab at all: for social problems, or for racial conflict, or for ecology, or for war. Fuck, understand. Everything is burning from all sides, and trust in the authorities, as well as electoral votes, disappeared before our eyes. And power is such a thing that can't just disappear into thin air. If someone loses, someone else will definitely acquire it, if he turns out to be quite smart, and takes advantage of the situation correctly. Meet Edmund Maskey, one of the first environmentalist politicians in the United States, and in the world as a whole. He was a member of the Democratic Party in Maine, and the state of Maine. This is such a paradise of nature, in the northern part of the country, which is known for its lakes, forests, and cliffs on the coast. According to the type of Karelia in our country, only the state of Maine is twice as small in area, and twice as large in population, and there are about 5,000 rivers and lakes and various bays in Maine, and most people earned money there by raising livestock and fishing. If he gained popularity in his state due to the fact that he accused all enterprises of shitting the entire nature of the state with their waste, then a bunch of factories just stand there, drain their waste into our clean rivers, and the government closes its eyes and does not want to do anything about it. And the more people shared the position of the young politician. He traveled all over the region, spoke in all cities in front of people, and in each of his speeches, he urged people to wake up and look around. To look at how factories pollute our rivers, how enterprises emit a lot of harmful substances into the air, how forests are being cut down, and that at this rate, they will soon live on a toxic garbage dump from production waste. All this led to the fact that Musk became governor of the state in January of the 55th, and the first thing he did was to fulfill his election promises. He gathered around him a team of like-minded people from the government who also shared his point of view, and began pushing the idea of creating the Department of Environmental Protection of the state of Maine, which would have the authority to control everything in forestry, marine and coastal fisheries, and in general everything is connected with nature. It took some time, but the main thing is that the idea was accepted, and the Masks were allowed to assemble a committee. For 4 years, the government has developed legislation that established standards for emissions and waste for enterprises located in Maine, and instructed the committee to monitor this case. Since this was the very first version of a law of this kind, it looked something like this. So guys, you're producing a bunch of shit here, so this is, well, have a conscience at least not to drain it directly into the lake. Take it to the landfill there, or at least around the corner, brotherly. At the same time, fines were provided for non-compliance with the law, which the Nature Protection Committee regularly levied, and the Masks redirected these funds to schools and universities. By the end of the 60s, he was already a prominent politician at the national level, who was aiming for the Senate, by the way. The Senate. This is the central governing body in the United States, like our Federation Council, with nuances of course. Well, about the same. Due to the fact that he continued to meet people all the time, and did not hesitate to conduct an open debate, he had a lot of fans. And he managed to get into the Senate as a result. And that's when Patterson notices him, who was at war with the entire scientific community with his research on lead. Patterson, who was destroyed by respected scientists and scientists. I scored a bolt on scientific journals and just started sending the results of my research directly to senators. And first of all, of course, she got to the mast. When the results fell on his desk, Edmund clung to them like a lifeline. Patterson's research clearly showed that industry causes enormous harm to the environment and human health. And he couldn't miss it in any way. Since Muskie was already a very prominent political figure, he managed to push through the government, the budget for the committees on water and air protection, and he generally began to prepare his bills on this account. His logic was exactly the same as in the state. Look, we are introducing emission standards and penalties for non-compliance, which we will then spend on education. And they took care of the environment, and calmed people down, and spent money on education. What else pleased people and political glasses? Here they are, here in my pocket. The solution is perfect, I think. And in 1963, the world's first air pollution law appears, which operates throughout the country. It was used both by production and by car. If we talk about cars, then according to this law, the amount of nitrogen and carbon dioxide that a car produces had to be reduced by 85%. Not bad then. Roughly speaking, the average car then emitted 87 grams of carbon dioxide per mile, and it was necessary to do 13. In what way? Yes, it is not very clear. It sounds wild that it was necessary to reduce the amount of shit in the exhaust almost 10 times at a time, but, fortunately, automakers had a solution on how to fit into the norm, and even the stock will remain. And this is the solution. The catalyst. By this time, they were already sometimes installed at enterprises that were smoking Trindeco right now, and it could theoretically be pushed into a car. The catalyst. This is such an iron jar, inside which there are metal honeycombs with special metals that accelerate chemical reactions. On the fingers, dirty air enters the jar, magic happens, and much cleaner air comes out. This explanation will be enough for us. I just don't want to load you with chemical processes. We don't need it. Just remember that the catalyst neutralizes all the crap in the exhaust of the car. Not completely, but a very large part. The problem is that the catalyst was not compatible with lead gasoline. The lead clogged all the cells very quickly, and the catalyst simply stopped working. And automakers are like this. We're all for it. We have to put the cat in our car. Shit question. It just won't work. We have nothing to do with it. It's all to the oilmen go. And oilmen are like that. Since first of all it was necessary to deal with lead, with the filing of the Mask and Patterson in 1965, the Institute of Health collects a symposium on the dangers of lead gasoline. In addition to Patterson, there were a number of doctors and scientists at this meeting who also had research results on their hands, that the norm of 80 milligrams of lead per 100 milliliters of blood has a very bad effect on people's health. Keho is the devil's advocate, who defended lead all the way, showed up at this symposium, and started singing his old songs about the main thing, that there is no evidence that lead is harmful. Fuck you, if anything. Yura is over there. But, for the first time in his life, they publicly began to show him that dad. Hello, you are not stupid. We have research. And in fact, it was the first meeting of some officials, at which it was not decided that everything was fine with lead, and you cannot sweat. But on the other hand, no radical measures were taken either. We just ran into Cat and dispersed. But Maskey finally decided that he would not get off the manufacturers of lead gasoline. A year later, a meeting of the Committee on Water and Air Pollution is going to be held, at which Maskey again chaired, and he decided to arrange a public cross-poll of Patterson and Keh. Here is the official transcript of the meeting. Are you fucking in the end, you fucking devils? Which one? Your conclusion is that there was no increase in the amount of lead in the atmosphere. Fuck, we've been fucked. Fuck you. Your microphone. There is not the slightest evidence that any changes have taken place in this picture during this period. Not the slightest. After that, Patterson was pulled out, who furiously smashed the health service and Keh into fluff and feathers. He showed that tons of lead get into the atmosphere along with the exhaust. And since he kills people slowly, no one notices it. And he also claimed that the health service is in collusion with the oil industry anyway, since he sees no other reason why they don't ban leaded gasoline. Ethyl is a crime that is being committed against our citizens. That's Patterson's main point. He was finally heard. This meeting was a turning point in the issue of lead gasoline. Masks are finally going to prepare a legislative framework for limiting additives that can be added to fuel, and after some time, the Environmental Protection Department comes out with a proposal from the mast. Not with a ban, with a proposal to reduce lead by 60%. The industry is going berserk, considering this proposal extremely radical. Patterson, who considered him extremely light, also goes into a rage. Patterson, drooling with rage, realizes that, apparently, more arguments against lead are needed, and begins to study the bones of ancient people, and that's what he gets from the various exhibits. First, he took some Peruvian tooth, which was 4,500 years old, and calculated that the lead in the total mass of calcium in this tooth was 5 and 6 by 10 to minus the 8th degree. This is such a number. Then, he took the bone of some Egyptian who lived 2,200 years ago, and it was already 70 by 10 in minus 8. This is such a number. That is 12.5 times more than in the Purin tooth. And in the skeleton of his contemporary, Patterson found 3,500 to 10 minus the 8th degree of lead in the total mass of calcium. This is such a number. That is, there was 50 times more lead in a man of the 70s than in an Egyptian, and 600 times more than in Peruvians. After this research, the scientific community is like this. Well, this is somehow generally Fig's nose. We definitely have nothing to cover. And industry, in turn, defended itself by saying that lead gasoline is the blood of the economy. Plus, all the production plants, of which there were already a lot, these are all jobs, these are taxes, this is money. And healthcare professionals understood that, as long as the economic truth is on the side of producers, people are ready to breathe dirty air if they have dirty money in their pockets. And clean air and an empty stomach didn't bother anyone. It's like smoking. Everyone knows that it's harmful, but they still smoke because they get high. Plus, if you give up lead, it's the re-equipment of all factories in general. It's the reduction of the current staff, hiring and training a new one. It's the development of new technologies, and it's all expensive. Plus, automakers sang along with the oilmen that they should install a catalyst made of precious metals on all cars. It will be expensive for the consumer. And if the services and committees still somehow doubted, then there was no stopping the mast. He put pressure on oil companies and automakers from two sides. For some, it limited the volume of additives, and for others, harmful emissions. His new version of the law on air and water pollution was his political trump card, which he played very brightly and effectively in front of the public. By this time, he had already gained such popularity that he was going to participate in the presidential race. And, in one of his campaign speeches, he said, quote, "Detroit told the nation that Americans can't live without a car. This law will tell Detroit that they will have to make a car that Americans can live with." He did not win the presidential race, but remained in the country's top leadership, and continued his methodical struggle with lead and dirty exhaust. Collectively, the war with the producers of lead gasoline lasted for almost 25 years. The first meeting on the dangers of lead was held in 1965, and the document completely prohibiting the use of lead additives was signed only in 1990. And according to this document, only in 5 years, by the 31st of December 1995, there should not be a drop of lead fuel left at all US gas stations. Automakers were required to install a catalyst in their cars in absolutely all models. And the main character of this whole story, and this victory, of course, is Claire Patterson, a geologist turned scientist who wanted to work for the good of people. At the end of his life, he was accepted into the National Academy of Sciences of the USA and awarded him the most prestigious prize in the field of environmental science at Styler. And all the measures he took to ensure the sterility of laboratories, because of which his colleagues mocked him, are now standard procedures. Claire Patterson was born on June 2, 1922, a year after Catherine patented tetraethyl lead. And Patterson will not live to see a complete ban on lead for literally 25 days. He will remove the 5th of December 1995. Throughout the second half of his life, until his death, he fought to make lead disappear forever from the air that we breathe. And in fact, they left together. And the corporations that caused enormous damage to the environment, there was nothing. In addition to the fact that they were forbidden to produce bodies. The only one who was publicly crucified and blamed for all the troubles was Thomas Midgley, who invented the third lead. Despite the fact that Midgley remained an employee on a salary all his life, unlike the same catering, which received dividends from patents, was in a share in enterprises and Teal and so on. Midgley didn't make some huge nettle fortune, didn't get some high-ranking chair in the corporation. He was just getting some kind of salary. And when the war with the body began, he received all the hatred from environmentalists and scientists in his address, although he warned catering and the corporation that lead is dangerous. And he didn't earn a penny on it, unlike the billions that GEM made. Thanks to ethyl, GEM overtook Ford in profit in the middle of the century, and to abandon the bodies would be a disaster for their financial statements. Not Miles, but lawyers of GEM's Standard Swill pushed through the use of bodies, even when scientists had evidence of its danger. But nobody cares. Midgley is still considered the person who caused the greatest damage to the ecology of the planet. And corporations. And what about corporations? We're just making stuff here. We're not in business at all. Midgley invented it. We have something to do with it. Over the past 40 years, starting from the 80s, a lot of research has been conducted on the effects of lead on the body. Scientists studied children who were born in the 70s and 80s, followed their lives, their development to modern times. In short, it was found out that the generation that grew and formed when using lead gasoline has a lower irritability, concentrates less on completing tasks, is more difficult to train, and so on. In the 2013 year, a large study was completed, which revealed a direct relationship between the lead content in the blood of people with the crime rate and the number of crimes committed by these people. Criminals have always had more lead in their blood than law-abiding citizens. And in particular, scientists have linked the hell that was going on in Detroit in the 80s and 90s, when the crime rate there was off the scale, and the city turned from a thriving industrial paradise into a terrible ruin, where it was very dangerous to be. The then residents of Detroit had the highest levels of lead in their blood compared to the whole country. After the start of body restrictions, the lead level began to plummet. Already in 1994, even before the complete ban of lead gasoline, the level of lead in the blood of Americans fell by 78% compared to the 70s. And in the modern world, this level is already negligible. I tell. One of the most dangerous poisons that the industry has given us, and which has poisoned millions of people around the world. The corporation and the economy earned billions, and people earned the disease. And for the fact that this threat no longer hangs over people, one stubborn scientist needs to be thanked, with whom no bureaucratic machine, not a corporation or a state, could do anything. And even though Claire Patterson participated in the creation of the atomic bomb, which claimed thousands of lives, as a result of his work and his whole life, this scientist saved many more people from slow destruction by invisible poison, and completely redeemed himself in the eyes of humanity. After a huge anti-pollution mask company was deployed in the States, the whole world begins to look closely at the environment and pay more attention to events that are somehow connected with it. And there was something to pay attention to. The first big event that everyone paid attention to was the London smog of 1952, which I have already told you about. And 4 years later, in the 56th, scientists in Japan discover some new strange mental disorder in residents, mainly children, in the city of Minamata. The hospital admitted children who moved very sluggishly, spoke poorly, and periodically had seizures. At first, scientists thought that this was some kind of new infection, since the number of cases was growing exponentially. Then similar symptoms were found in cats, which also twitched quite strangely, fell in convulsions, and the rest of the time were very sluggish. And when dead crows sometimes began to fall from the sky, even scientists are like that. Colleague, aren't birds supposed to fly from the bottom up? Apparently, this is a new type, reversible birds. Well, if that's the case, let's put it in the Red Book, otherwise it will suddenly die out. After studying all the victims, the scientists found out that they all lived in fishing villages on the coast of Minamata Bay. And cats too. And the main diet in the fishing village is, oddly enough, fish, which also sometimes swam belly up in the bay. Tired of swimming, apparently, that's resting. And when the guys raised their heads and looked upstream, they saw the kissed chemical plant there, which was throwing its waste into the water, and didn't worry about anything at all. Chemical analysis of the water showed that there is everything in the water except water. There was lead, mercury, manganese, arsenic, selenium, thallia, and other elements. But mercury acted most strongly on the body, which was the most in the water. The official recognition of Minamata's disease happened only 12 years later, in 1968. And only then did the authorities take over the plant in order to somehow limit pollution. All the previous time, the plant was paying off, forcing people and fishermen to keep silent about problems and plug all mouths with loot that wanted to object at least something. And after the recognition of pollution, the consequences were raked out for the next 30 years. For the first 2,000 years, 2,265 people are listed in the lists of official victims of the plant, 174 of whom died. In 1957 year, the first radiation emergency in the USSR occurs. It happened at the Mayak chemical plant in Chelyabinsk 40. Not to be confused with Chelyabinsk, it's a completely different place. The modern name of this town, Ozersk. And to put it simply, a tank with radioactive waste just exploded there. The explosion was tens of tons in TNT equivalent and covered the whole region with a radioactive cloud. The consequences have been raked for decades, and now the East Ural Nature Reserve, with such a slight taste of radiation, is located at the site of the explosion. 80,000 people were officially recognized as victims. These are the people who lived on the site of the incident, as well as the liquidators of the consequences. According to the scale of radiation contamination, only the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters were stronger than this accident. And in 1963, there was a landslide in the Italian Alps. In 45 seconds, according to various estimates, from 2 to 300 million cubic meters of rock fell into the local reservoir. Such a speed and such a volume of rock created a wave 90 meters high, which moved at a speed of 12 meters per second. In 7 minutes, the wave completely washed away 5 villages and caused serious damage to some settlements in the valley. The result, from 2,500 to 3,000 dead according to various estimates. And there were many such events. Here and there on the planet, there were either natural disasters, such as landslides or earthquakes, or man-made disasters, explosions, emissions and chemicals, pollution of the surrounding area. And from all this, most importantly, people died. And when people die somewhere, it always causes unrest and worries in society. When there was a request for someone to take up ecology on a global scale, everyone immediately turned towards the UN. What were they created for? In order to prevent world conflicts, in order to ensure world security. This is all blah blah. And here we have a world-class problem. Everyone has the same air, so who, if not him, should deal with this issue? Everything is logical. He joyfully took up the organization of a dialogue of all countries about the environment, but they quickly ran into a problem. They were all fucked up. Well, that is, everyone said, well done, you are doing a very important thing, we shake hands, but let's somehow without us. It is also important to clarify the point that it is maintained at the expense of the participating countries. That is, he does not earn any money by himself. All countries just throw themselves into the community, and that's how he lives. And when he comes to someone with a question, it means that after long explanations and praises, everything will end with a banal give money. It's like in a school parent chat with a class teacher. Everything will end sooner or later with the fact that it would be necessary to raise money for curtains. That's exactly the same bullshit, only at the state level. And the 70s. This is the time when everyone, well, really had a hard time with their jokes. The Cold War, the oil crisis of the 73rd year, which I was talking about, the US intervention in the Vietnam War, the Islamist uprising in Syria, the Watergate scandal, and the resignation of President Nixon in the United States, the lead 70s in Italy. This is actually a sluggish civil war, a cultural revolution in China, a military coup in Chile with Pinochet. And this list can be continued for a long time. You can just open Wikipedia and be blown away by how much was happening in the world at that time. The whole world was having fun and killing itself like a god. Nothing new, actually. And he's here with his own. And let's think about the air. There was no cash register at all, like a preacher who accidentally came to the order. But the guys didn't give up. They still wanted to get some kind of sane dialogue from the States. And he gathered me together with the composition and such, who wants to take on the task of getting the government of all countries, driving them through the brains, that they need to think about the environment, there to beat the thresholds of embassies, and generally work 24/7, while everyone else behind your back will tell you that you have gone. It's better to be busy, boya. Anyone interested? And in the general silence, one person with a sigh is like this. Well, let me try. That man was Morris Strong. And if Edmund Muskie can be considered the father of the environmental movement in the United States, then Strong. This is the person who gave this movement a global scale. The very first thing he did was to order the creation of a report on the state of ecology on the planet, which he named Only One Earth, caring for a small planet, in which he collected data from 158 scientists from 58 countries of the world. Now this report is being sold as books. By the way, it can be ordered on Amazon. And don't pay attention that Barbara Ward and Reem Duber are the authors there. Strong ordered them to write a book, as he did not know how, and there was no time. In 1972, at the next Unsabbath in Stockholm, Strong shows this book and the results that are actually given there. And they all said that yes, everything is bad. If you don't start doing ecology right now, then soon everyone will say hello to us. Everyone makes stern faces and decides that it is necessary to do a separate environmental program that will take care of the health of the planet and all that. They called the UNEP program, United Nations Invitation Programs. They put Strong in charge there and sent him to conquer the world. Why, by the way, is this called a program? I don't really get it, since in fact, it is a separate structural unit in the UN. Well, like right in the headquarters, offices, a large staff, budget, all that. Since he is. This is a diplomatic organization with its highest members. Higher members. There is an opportunity to open any embassies of any countries with your feet and schedule meetings with the country's top leadership. And if the purpose of the meeting is good deeds, in the name of all that is good, then of course, everyone is happy to welcome. Which, in fact, Strong stubbornly used. He toured all the important countries of the world, sought meetings with all the leaders and ruling elites, showed them the results of research, and said that it was necessary to gather in a crowd, well, right now, to make some joint decisions, since working alone would not do anything. Everyone has air and water in common. In parallel with this, a very important study comes to light. In 1975, an American climatologist, Wallace Broecker, published an article, Climate Change. Are we on the global warming road? In this article, Wallace suggested a possible change in the climate trend. From the 1940s to the 70s, there was a tendency for a general decrease in temperature, and Wallace said that in the near future, the trend will change to an increase, and that a period of global warming awaits us. And this was the first scientific article where, in fact, this term was used. One more time, until the 70s, the overall temperature dropped, and no one was embarrassed by it. But after she started to grow, everyone suddenly tensed up. And Wallace also argued that you can't look at just one indicator, but you need to look at the overall system as a whole. Like atmosphere, ice sheets at the poles, ocean, biosphere. This is all interconnected and will change together. Wallace's article made a shoo-in among the scientific community, and a large number of scientists rushed to study global processes. As you and I could see from the history of lead, which was cancelled for 20 years, changes do not occur quickly in big politics and in big structures. And Strong traveled for 20 years on personal meetings with various heads of state, communicated, showed research, persuaded, frightened, inspired. Anything to make the powerful of this world think about ecology. The dude has been listening for 20 years. Oh boy, get the fuck out of here. Don't bother doing business. We have a whole mountain of people here. They don't kill themselves, so we have a lot of work to do. The result of Strong's 20-year work was the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in the 92nd year, where 8,000 delegates from different countries and 3,000 representatives of non-governmental international organizations gathered under the roof of one building. This is the biggest event in the history of the planet dedicated to ecology, the motto of which was our last chance to save the planet. The main agenda was something like this, that guys, you are here. We're here. Here. Either we're straight now, right now, we are doing something, or we need to dump on Mars. Oh wait, we can't go to Mars. We don't have the technology. Therefore, we need to do something right now. Naturally, everyone is like that in response. It turns out that we will have to do something with this ecology. Apparently, yes, human lives, it's important. I wonder if they know that we want to throw missiles at a neighboring state. If we make a rocket that doesn't leave a carbon footprint, then they won't mind, it seems to me. I like this concern for the environment. I wonder what will happen if this Penguin rocket. The most important thing that happened at the Earth Summit, it finally dawned on everyone that we really need to do something about ecology. And the lands of the 92nd year themselves. This is the first large-scale event of this kind, which ended not just with smiles and handshakes, but with the signing of real documents. At the summit itself, 180 countries signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This document seemed to recognize climate change at the global level, and that almost all countries of the world would act in a coordinated and common front. There were three main areas in which it was necessary to work. The first, reducing the toxicity of industrial emissions and completely getting rid of lead gasoline. By the 92nd year, the Tela was still being produced, and it would be finally slowed down only 3 years later. Second, development of alternative energy sources to replace fossil fuels. At that time, the overwhelming share of energy was generated from fossil fuels. These are oil, gas, and coal. And how do they get energy from this? Stupidly burning. Yeah. Technological progress looks exactly like this, yes. And when you burn fuel in huge volumes, at the same time, you burn a huge amount of environmental bugs. And so that this does not happen, it is necessary to develop alternative sources. Third, that's how he showed it. It is necessary to increase confidence in public transport in order to transfer people to it, and force them to abandon personal cars in big cities. And there will be fewer traffic jams, the environment will be better. The only negative, cyclists. But the more cyclists there are, the fewer cyclists there are. In addition, the guys there also discussed water supplies. Something like people became a fig, and the water is not up to a fig. But we are motorists here, mentally healthy people, so we are not interested in liquids, only gasoline. We will not talk about water. In short, the most important thing is that the path is marked. Everyone shook hands with each other, and left to work, all the tasks to run up. And in the 97th year, the Kyoto Protocol is still being signed, which is, as it were, a consequence of the Framework Convention. Roughly speaking, the convention. That's right, okay, we've been persuaded, we'll do something about it. And the Kyoto Protocol. This is a document that says which country should do what specifically. The essence is something like this. The main task of the Kyoto Protocol. This is an overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions into the Earth's atmosphere. The countries have agreed among themselves that there are 6 main enemies of the atmosphere. These are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbon, perfluorocarbon, and X-graphite gray. Fuck, I said it the first time. These 6 guys are basically greenhouse gases. In fact, greenhouse gases are a normal thing. Don't throw just anything. Well, thanks to them we exist, if anything. These gases, which are in the air, also form our atmosphere and protect us from direct exposure to the sun. If they did not exist, then there would be no life on Earth either. But environmentalists have the logic that the additional emissions generated by industry increase this blanket in the atmosphere. And in this case, we will have a greenhouse effect, which will lead to global warming. And because of the increase in temperature, the glaciers at the poles will melt, and Venice will be washed away. Why environmentalists are worried about this, and not Venice, is not entirely clear. Although they have only gondoliers there, what to take with him? In fact, it was from these agreements that the familiar Euro emission standards appeared to all of us. Euro is the norm for exhaust. This is a document that limits the maximum permissible emissions from a car per kilometer of mileage. If a car does not fit into the Euro norm, then it simply cannot be sold on the territory of the state that introduced this norm at home. It all started with Euro 1, which was adopted a year after the Earth Summit in 1993. In fact, this norm abolished mechanical carburetors, since they could not accurately dose fuel and could pour it over. And this is already impossible according to the Euro 1 norm. And oxygen sensors, aka lambda, and fuel vapor capture systems were also introduced without fail. Euro 2 could only be performed on distributed injection. Mono injection didn't fit in anymore, either because of the accuracy. And Euro 4 could only be performed by exhaust gas recirculation systems. This is a system where part of your exhaust is fed back into the engine, so you have the same air used twice. And it was also necessary to additionally leave the phases of the regulator. Today, the Euro 6 norm is in force in Europe, and the Euro 7 norm is in development, which will be adopted for implementation this decade. And right now there is a discussion and bidding between car companies and states for the exact parameters of the Euro 7 norm. In fact, the question is as follows. Will it be possible in principle to fulfill the norms with an internal combustion engine or not? Moreover, the basic logic of norms. This is to bring emissions to zero. The guys all decided that the most important evil, this is an engine, and it is necessary to limit it to the limit. Well, that is so that the emissions are zero. In fact, this is what the ban looks like. Since it is physically impossible to make the internal combustion engine emit nothing into the atmosphere. At the same time, all modern engines that fit the Euro 6 norm are already so clean that they generate less solid particles than both the erasable pads in the brake system and the erasable tires. When you run out of pads, brake discs or rubber, it doesn't mean that they magically evaporated. You just smeared them evenly over the distance that you drove by car. And such solid particles from rubber, pads and discs fly into nature, much more than solid particles from the operation of a modern internal combustion engine. Even modern diesels that fit Euro 6 are cleaner for nature than your braking system. And also remember scenes from movies where some person was locked in a car, an exhaust pipe was brought to him there, and he suffocated after a while. It's impossible to do this with a modern engine. The only thing that can suffocate a person in such a situation is if he exhales all the oxygen in the car himself. But this can be done in any closed and non-ventilated space. You can suffocate in your closet if you seal it well enough. And a modern engine can't kill anyone purely physically, even if you try very hard. But do you think anyone is taking this attention? No, of course not. Everyone is too lazy to use logic and common sense. It's much easier to draw zeros on a piece of paper and demand execution in some wonderful fucking way. Now, instead of the Kyoto Protocol, a new version is in effect, which is called the Paris Agreements of the 2015 year, where countries declared an even greater war with the CO2 and outlined a zero-emission strategy. Automakers have now hit the development of new electric platforms, new technologies, electric vehicles, hydrogen cars, that's all. It is quite obvious that Euro 7 is the last norm that can be fulfilled with a traditional internal combustion engine. And then there will be something else. Something else that you and I will ride in our clean and eco-friendly future. In fact, thanks to the strength and perseverance of Maurice Strong, thanks to scientists and all concerned people, the issue of ecology is now very actively and widely discussed in the world. Humanity in a crowd is now thinking about what is happening with the environment and with our nature as a whole. And ecology. This is a very righteous topic of the modern world. They discuss it, they argue, and they bring it as an argument in disputes. Practically at every meeting of the powerful, this issue will be raised one way or another. And it is ecology that is primarily cited as an argument in favor of the fact that we need to throw out the internal combustion engine as soon as possible and transfer the whole crowd to a penguin-friendly type of car. Yes, that's right. I agree with everyone. I fully accept and support this point of view. If not for one nuance. A tiny one that haunts me. (1981), a court case against a certain company Azul Resources, which was engaged in the sale of oil in Denver, Colorado. The company's management was accused of artificially inflating the company's stock prices before the merger. What is the point of inflating the price of shares, I think, is clear. You inflate the price, they buy you more than you are, you withdraw money, and you are in the ladies. And the fact that someone else has spent more money on you than you are actually worth is his problem. And in fact, the management of Azul forged all the reports, overstated all the indicators in order to make money on it. But fortunately, they were caught by the ass, and the deal was cancelled. And a court case was immediately opened against the company's executives. Meet the managers of Azul Resource. Ah, you've already met. This is my row. So wait, painted. You were just telling me that he's all holy here. And now what happens? That environmentalists can also be Ani. Yeah. Despite the fact that all the machinations of the company and the management were revealed after this failed merger, it is still acquired by another oil company, Tosco. And all Azul got off with was a fine of $4 and $2 million. $4 and $2 million is a very severe punishment for an oil company. Yeah. Sweep the floor with the accounting department and just about collect that much. Here's another class action lawsuit from the state of Colorado, plus human rights activists and water companies of 1992. Against Audi. Not an Audi, but an Audi. This is America Water Cycling Inc., which was founded by Maurice Strong. After that deal, Wenzel still managed to sell a certain Tosca. Maurice leaves the management and buys a hefty ranch in Colorado, which, by a lucky chance, belonged to Tosco Corporation before him. That is, at first, a person tried to make the company much more expensive. They catch him by the ass, they issue fines. Despite this, he still sells the company to another corporation, and then, purely by chance, comes out of this transaction with a plot of land that was the size of some miserable 65,000 hectares. How can I explain to you what 65,000 hectares is? A football field, can you imagine, which is standard, on the recommendation of FIFA. 105 by 68 meters. So, 65,000 hectares. This is 91,036 such fields. Not quite clear, right? So far, it's clear that it's just up to the dick and more, but it's not clear exactly how much. I am from Veliki Novgorod, not from Nizhny Novgorod. Please note, hello to all Astafevs in Nizhny Novgorod. So, my hometown has an area of 90 square kilometers, or 9,000 hectares. Here at Strong's, a peace was formed with an area of 7 Great Novgorods. This plot is even larger than the area of Kazan, which is 50,000 hectares in total. In short, such a hefty ranch was formed at Strong, purely for the change from the deal. Initially, Strong planned to grow high-protein grain there, for supplies to starving countries. Such a noble mission, but in the process of construction, everything, guys, has changed. And purely by chance, again, they started building a water extraction plant there to pump out water and sell it. When local activists and the Environmental Protection Committee saw the size of the construction site and the planned design capacity of the plant, their hair stood on end. Since if the plant started, it would pump out water in such volumes that it would definitely cause irreparable damage to the entire ecosystem of the region. So that you understand the scale, at that time there were 25 enterprises in the region that extracted water, and so, all of them combined, produced less water than Strong's company had planned. One company would simply dry up the entire ecosystem of an entire state. The whole state sued. It's real. Well, those who were aware of the situation, and the court ruled that yes, Strong's company is fucked up, and the plant cannot be opened, and there can be no talk of any extraction, and ordered the company to pay $3 million for legal costs. I'll explain. Court costs are just an invoice for the work of lawyers, courts, that's all, for several years of work. And the company did not incur any fines or any other punishment. And while the trial was going on, Strong was like this, well, the plan didn't work, and he safely left the company. Well, you know, we live in Russia. But wait though. But my favorite court case is against molten metal technology, about overestimating the value of shares, and embezzlement of grants from the government. Overestimation of stock prices. Something familiar, right? That's right. Morris Strong became a director of this company in 1989. The company has developed a technology for waste disposal by dissolving them in liquid metal. You throw all this shit into molten metal, and it burns there in some very specific way and completely disappears, without harmful emissions and garbage. Well, at least that's what the company said. Do you feel yes, who is good with dates? 1989 is right before the Earth Summit. And the director of a waste disposal company, using the diplomatic status of a missionary, travels to meetings with heads of state and tells them about environmental problems. And so absolutely casually, it has a solution to some questions with waste. And what does this mean for the company? Naturally, the fact that only one American department has allocated $25 million in grants for the disposal of all kinds of waste. It is not known how much money was raised for the company from various departments and heads of state. Well, it seems like everything is fine. Allocated money, allocated waste, and recycle. Yes, only the company could not fulfill the volume. There was technology, but it worked only on trial small batches, and at least some noticeable amount of technology could not live purely physically. And Morris knew it. And quite calmly at public events, he talked about the fact that molten was metal. This is an ideal technology, and his company will be able to solve absolutely all issues with the disposal of expenses. And the company's shares, of course, grew up. And Strong owned 40,000 shares. And 262,000 shares were held by companies in which Strong was also chairman. A weighty argument for pushing up the cost, isn't it? At the moment when the stock reaches its peak of $49 and a penny, Strong abruptly sells his personal shares of molten metal. And the companies controlled by him also merge their papers. And the whole market is such a stop, it was the mother-in-law. And then, of course, the information is revealed that it's all just Nedolovo. Yes, the technology is there, but no one was going to put the plant up. And the stock dropped from $49 to 13 cents. And the company immediately declares itself bankrupt because it is not able to return any money. As a result, here is the official wording for this whole situation. The case was settled in the amount of $11.8 million without a ruling on the offense. That is, someone just paid $11.8 million to the US budget, and no one has any complaints to anyone. Whereas another $13 million from grants And where is all the money from the sale of 300,000 shares of the company, which is another $15 million, is not specified. And no one sees any problems. The case is hushed up, jammed. That's it? Have you guys decided? And, well, yes, well done. Yes, we are also fucking with Vasilyevich somehow. Well, okay. Did they organize some kind of criminal case for him there? Like us. Maurice Strong is a senior advisor to the Secretary General of the UN Assembly, senior advisor to the President of the World Bank, founder of NEFT, director of the University for Peace, head of the UN Assistance Program in Hungary, Africa, and organizer of the Earth Summit. Dear person, what are the punishments? You know, he doesn't live in Russia. Oh my God, what have you found out? A normal girl. Well, not without sin. Well, what can I do? But I gathered those parasites there and forced them to work, at least at the summit there. Yes, I agree. Well done. Only for all the agreements of the Earth Summit, the whole world put a bolt from a high bell tower. As a team, please note, the USA has signed the Kyoto Protocol, yes, but she did not ratify it. Ratification means application to execution. Well, that is like, by signing the document, the United States kind of promised that they would impose restrictions. But then we sat in our Congress and thought, oh, fuck all these agreements. Canada withdrew from the agreement altogether, and the rest of the countries signed, as it were, ratified. But practically no one is worried about implementation. Do you know why? But because there is no punishment for non-compliance. None at all. Just the guys out there will look with condemnation. Anything that can be loaded with a finger. In fact, what is an agreement on emission limits? So let's figure out what they mean for each individual country. You may think that you just need to control everything everywhere now, so that the factories don't shit in the rivers there, the air doesn't shit. Well, no, not really. The most important thing here is that any restrictions mean a slowdown in the development of the economy. Since enterprises need to be redone, some of them need to be closed altogether, something needs to be built from scratch. In short, the costs. And any costs aimed not at extracting additional profit, but at some third-party bullshit, are brakes on the development of the economy. Here, roughly speaking, imagine that you are the owner of the company. You built it, launched a production line, and the company started making money. Where is the most logical way to spend these funds? Of course, it is logical to spend money on the construction of another production line. Well, there, either to purchase additional equipment for new products, or to expand the staff, or to buy a new building. In short, invest somewhere that will give you an additional flow of money to continue the expansion later. And so on indefinitely, in theory. But what happens if you spend all the money you earn on planting bushes and trees on the territory of the plant? It will be beautiful and eco-friendly. Fact. But at this rate, the company itself will not last long, as it will simply lose the market, and its competitors will squeeze it out. If you don't develop, then you die. This is the law of the market economy. And so, roughly speaking, with the economy and restrictions, countries have exactly the same bullshit, only on a national scale. But the economies of all countries are different, and they shit into the atmosphere in different ways. For example, the United States, with its developed industry, has shot a lot more into the atmosphere. Over 100 years of operation of all enterprises and factories than, for example, India, whose rapid development of the economy and production began relatively recently. And that's how to solve this. It is wrong to limit India equally to the USA, since unequal conditions of development are obtained. India has not yet had time to throw out so much, but it gets the same cap as the United States. In this scenario, it turns out that developing countries will never catch up with developed ones. And this is wrong. This is discrimination. And that's what they came up without. All countries have different rates of emission reduction. Developed countries that have already shat so much into the atmosphere, they're like the USA and Europe, should now quickly, sharply reduce emissions. And developing countries like India, China, Russia, and others that have not yet had time to shit so much, are allowed to reduce emissions more slowly. And if you introduce fines, then it is quite possible that the economy, which has money, will still shit in the environment. Just pay the fine. And the developing economy will not be able to afford it. And it smelled of discrimination of the whole country again. Therefore, all restrictions are conditionally voluntary. And the most interesting thing is that, even if you take this mission responsibly, and act strictly according to the norms, you can still get out of the emission standards. You can buy an additional package for emissions from another country that has not fully used up its quota. I'm not kidding. Emission standards are now a trade item. Do you want to look good in his eyes, but not slow down the economy? Buy an extra package, and you'll be a sweetheart. In short, pay the money, and even shoot polar bears in the morning. We don't care. Well, in Europe, in this one, they at least take care of their own there. They put everything electric there, in these kerosene propellers. Here are the nuclear power plants at home, well done. Even though he's a faggot. Yes, but they have been doing this since the oil crisis, when the OPEC countries twisted their hands. Do you remember about the 73rd year? This madness of all European countries on green energy began from there, and not from the UN with its restrictions. The European Union does not have its own oil, its own gas, and any other fossil fuel in sufficient volume to exist normally and safely. And if they continue to sit on fossil fuels, they will be very dependent on OPEC countries and Russia, which supplies gas to Europe. And of course, the European Union does not like such a position as they are up. And they don't want to depend on oil and gas exporters. And even if the OPEC countries and Russia are cute cats, who will not twist the arms of the European Union, fossils are still unprofitable for them. When there is some limited resource, it will always inexorably become more expensive over time, as it will become less and less. Here is a graph of the cost of oil. Here is a graph of the cost of gas. Gold, silver, platinum. Open the graph of the cost of any other finite resource, and you will see exactly the same picture there. In the future, it will become very expensive for the European Union to live on fossil fuels. They simply won't be able to pull it off with their economy. And have you seen the price of fuel in the European Union? It's not there, because everyone lives so curly, it's just expensive. And it will become even more expensive. And at any moment, the supplier country can twist your hands by raising the tariff or refusing to supply. And your people will die of cold and hunger. Why are you so negative? Well, there's definitely something. This Edmund. Masks like this, who became governor there, pressed the lead, here, but a normal guy. Edmund Maskey was a member of the Democratic Party, and by the time Maskey appeared in the political arena, the Republicans ruled the country. And his home state of Maine was Republican to the core. The only way to defeat a very strong party in power in the elections is to play on people's discontent and promise people a solution to their problems. And then, people were worried about the environment. That's what the masks were playing on. And when the party saw that one local candidate had a bet on ecology, and he got the governor's seat in a state where he had no support, they began to push the same agenda across the country and support the rhetoric of the mask. Because people hoped and were ready to vote for someone who would deal with their environmental problems. And the politicians. These are the people who play on people's feelings and trust. All without exception. The real problem that Edmund was dealing with is the aging of the able-bodied population. People who were born fat in the 1910s and 20s were already too close to retirement, and very soon they would become an expenditure part of the budget. And there were physically few young people born in the 30s and 40s. Since the 30s, this is the Great Depression in the States, where people had no time for children, and the 40s. Well, you know, and if this, already a small stratum of citizens, would also die en masse because of the environmental situation, then the economy would collapse altogether. You have only pensioners on the balance sheet, and there is no one to work. And you're not going to go out to people with the fact that, guys, this is the case here. I need to somehow come up with something, so that we can stretch out a little more for you, so that we can earn money on you normally for the budget while a new generation is growing. Therefore, let us now make your living and working conditions a little better. Just don't move the horses, please. We still need your taxes. People will pick you up on a pitchfork if you tell them that. Therefore, ecology and care for future generations. Lead, by the same logic, is finally abolished only at the moment when research has appeared that the new generation that grew up with lead has a lower IQ than the previous one. And stupid citizens. This is increased aggression. This is an increased crime rate, which drags additional expenses from the budget. And these people will not be able to earn normally. They are stupid. Therefore, several $billion right now from lead have become less profitable than another lost generation. And according to the same logic, no one paid attention to the first death at the ethyl plant, even in construction. Several dozen deaths, and newly minted clients of mental hospitals. This is a reasonable payment for billions of dollars in the economy and for thousands of jobs. It's even a very reasonable fee. Patterson, yes. A man who really genuinely worried about people's health. But it was not holy righteousness that moved him, but his immense sense of guilt before humanity, which devoured him from the inside, because he was related to the nuclear bomb that was dropped on Japan. What do we have left? Prohibition. Guess for yourself. Remember all the righteous speeches of the holy activist fathers that America is mired in drunkenness, and time will clear up. Check business. That's where the main beneficiary is. Standard Oil, right? Rockefeller was an open sponsor of the entire anti-alcohol movement, motivating it by the fact that he is a righteous man, does not believe in God. Everything like that. He openly transferred charitable contributions to the anti-saloon movement and encouraged them in every possible way. Plus, he constantly attended the sermons of the Holy Fathers who supported Prohibition and talked with them for a long time, and said that they were doing a righteous deed for the good of the whole country. How true Rockefeller's faith in God and sobriety was, I will not judge. But this man has always had faith in the dollar. And alcohol, and all alcoholic beverages. It was the main competitor of Standard Oil at that time. Remember, I said alcohol was an alternative. Rockefeller killed this alternative with a dry law. With his level of influence and capabilities, we recall this caricature of Otto Kepler, giving virtually unlimited finances to the activist movement, and then pushing the law through administrative levers, is quite a feasible task. In general, when you say the name Rockefeller out loud, a whole carload of conspiracy theories, Freemasons, reptilians, this shit immediately leaves with her. I don't care about these fantasies. I always look at what people are doing specifically. And in the 10th year, when the anti-Saudi movement was gaining momentum, Rockefeller and his whole family openly told that they were sponsoring activists. But they were silent about the fact that they were going to kill competitors in fuel for cars. Do you know what the Rockefeller family foundations are doing now? They are all invested in the development of alternative energy sources in all possible ways, and satisfied. They tell about it on every corner. For example, most recently, representatives of the Rockefeller Family Foundation came out with a statement that they withdraw funds from companies that are engaged in mining and transfer funds to the development of alternatives. And of course, all this was served with the sauce that we are saving the planet from terrible hydrocarbons. But to smart questions from smart people in a narrow audience, representatives replied that it was simply no longer profitable for them to keep their funds in this industry. Alternative sources. This is a new, if I may say so, hype niche. And in the long run, it's just possible to earn more. And if at the same time, you can still put on an aura of nobility, of course, in General Chico's. Do you know who else is actively investing in the alternative? Strange OPEC. The sheiks are now loading all available funds into the development of new energy sources. And do you seriously think that the guys are very worried about some piece of ice with penguins? Standard Oil. This is a company that emerged 150 years ago from a small factory in Zazapai, and then grew to a global giant with enormous influence. And OPEC. These are people who, 80 or 90 years ago, were sitting in the desert with a bare ass, riding a camel, and now, All the world's elites communicate with them on an equal footing. And when you have risen from the shit and the wilds to the world level of influence, do you want to lose this power? Of course not. And since the rejection of carbon is an issue that has already been resolved, it's just a matter of time. Then the power of suppliers and exporting countries. It's also a matter of time, at least if they don't do anything about it. Therefore, now everyone has rushed headlong into the alternative. Since the first one who breaks into this niche will ensure his dominance in it and will rule the world. But no one will talk about it. Just like at the beginning of the 20th century, no one said that prohibition was simply the elimination of a competitor from the market. When the anti-saloon movement was gaining momentum, Rockefeller and the entire oil industry were shouting at every corner that alcohol was killing the nation and our future generations. But they did it not out of righteousness, but out of profit. They needed a fuel market, and alcohol had to be removed from it. Replace alcohol with carbon footprint and global warming in the formulations of the 20s of the 20th century, and you will get the same formulations. And just as they were at war with alcohol because of the sales market, so now they are at war with hydrocarbons because of the sales market. And the same people do it. And life is a very ironic thing. Sometimes, you look at the events that took place, look at their causes, their consequences, and start laughing homerically. Because prohibition, which the authorities together with the church pushed through in order for America to be cleansed and embark on a righteous path, led to the emergence of a strong and world-famous American mafia in the country. There was a black market for alcohol, there was a lot of money in the hands of criminals, and the level of corruption increased at times, since all underground bars needed a roof. And the situation with alcohol at the end of the law was much worse than at the time of its adoption. Americans ended up drinking even more, and the only one who turned out to be in the ladies is Standard Oil. Well, gas station networks and the automotive industry, which grew by leaps and bounds. After the repeal of the law, Rockefeller was interviewed, in which he said that he regretted that he took part in the creation of prohibition and apologized to citizens. In general, one sad interview. It's not such a big price to pay for conquering the market. And when I found out the following fact, I was like, fuck it. Do you know who was one of the most influential representatives of the former Standard toy companies in world politics, and a representative of the interests of the family? Maurice Strong. He was engaged in oil in his youth. At first, he participated in trading transactions on the stock exchange, studied, and in general studied the world of oil there. He met the managers of Standard well, and they dragged him out as a volunteer, just so that he could establish contacts and acquaintances there. There he meets the chief treasurer of the riot police, and he actually introduced him to David Rockefeller, Johnny's grandson. Morris told me about it himself, if anything. And in parallel with the Strong worked as an assistant to Jack Gallagher, the head of the Standard Toy Company in Canada. Then, Strong worked in Africa for the humanitarian aid mission to the region there with such stuff. And at the same time, he managed the Cultex division, the daughter of Standard Toy in Africa. When Maurice conducted the merger of Azul Resources, Standard Toy managers were on the board with him at that time. And the Tosca company, which bought Azul, is also the former Standard of ECOLOGY, to which the railway mining plant was attached. Wherever you spit in the oil industry, you will always stumble upon Standard Oil. And for the summit in the 72nd year, when the UNEP, the ecology program, was created, this is all bullshit. The speech for Morris's speech was written by the Preservice of the Standard. And the headquarters of UNEP, this environmental rescue program, was organized in the city of Nairobi, where the Coltex office is located. Standard. Any other questions? Why are there so many court cases and so few punishments? So I don't either. I'll tell you the last funny fact about the father of world ecology, and leave him alone. Fuck him. Strong died quite recently, a few years ago. They kept him, of course, as the father of the world ecological movement, as the most righteous person in the fight for our Mother Nature. Guess what this man left behind? In addition to his fortune, of course, he left an eco-hotel for his son, which was built in a protected area in Costa Rica where construction and deforestation are prohibited. It is impossible to cut down reserves. It is impossible to build there. But if you are an ecologist, especially such a respected one, then so be it, you're a good one. But let's go back actually to cars. At the fourth hour of the narration, at the very time, since the zero-emission strategy has been adopted, the internal combustion engine is being taken away from us. For the good of the environment. Those are aware. Let's say. But what is offered to us in return? So far, there are two chairs. The first one. These are electric cars simply powered by batteries that need to be charged from an outlet, or hydrogen cars powered by fuel cells. Hydrogen cars are cars with a chemical generator that runs on liquefied hydrogen and generates electricity. Electricity is supplied to the batteries that power the electric motors, and the car goes. For the user, they will be very similar to a regular car. I filled it with hydrogen and went. To begin with, let's look at how energy is generated in our world. Here are the statistics for today, where we see that 85% of energy is still obtained by burning hydrocarbons. At the same time, do not confuse electricity and energy. These are different things. Electricity is what you have in the socket, and energy is everything that moves in one way or another, in principle, all over the world. If we take only electricity, which is a component of all energy, then the situation there is not dramatic. To date, 63.3% of the total electricity is generated by burning fossil fuels, mainly coal. And in the 2000th year, this percentage was 64.8. In 21 years, the share has fallen by exactly 1.5%. We are going to gardening at a Stakhanov pace, But let's imagine that this is solvable. They will develop technologies for wind turbines, solar panels, set up more hydroelectric power plants, nuclear power plants. Okay, let's say. And also let's assume that wires will be dragged everywhere, and there will be sockets on every corner, and you will be able to put your electric charge everywhere. Here in such a pink world, let's fast forward and think, what the fuck are we going to do with batteries in it? To begin with, let's throw a little bit on what a battery is. Depending on the type of construction, there may be a lot of interesting things inside. For example, the battery that you have under the hood of a gasoline car is usually lead acid. That is, with simple intellectual exercises, you and I can understand that there is lead dioxide, and a solution of sulfuric acid inside. Very eco-friendly, guys. It's especially fun to watch the guys in India deal with dead batteries. But these are Hindus, they are not people. The main thing is that in Europe, acid was not drained anywhere like this. But God be with him with lead-acid batteries, because when the internal combustion engine is cancelled, they will also stop producing them. Figs with him. We are interested in lithium-ion batteries here, since they are put in all electric cars, and in general, modern everything works on them. Gadgets, wearable electronics, and anything else that can work autonomously. Of course, the main element in such a battery is lithium. In fact, lithium is the new oil in the modern world. The volume of demand and use of lithium has been growing exponentially over the past 30 years. The first lithium-ion battery appeared in 1991. From that time, no one really needed lithium, turned into one of the most popular elements for the modern economy. And all concerned people who want to rid the world of these terrible hydrocarbons that come from the bowels of our holy Mother Earth. Pray at lithium. Where the fuck does lithium come from? From space, of course. It arrives to us on an eco-friendly spaceship of the future and is unloaded into virgin forests. This is sarcasm, in case you suddenly didn't understand, my sensitive ones. Lithium is extracted either from a rock enriched with lithium or from salt marshes, in the brine of which there is also a fig of lithium. And the largest lithium mining, for example, is deployed in Chile and in African countries. In order to extract 1 ton of lithium, how much rock do you think needs to be shoveled? 10 tons. 50 tons. Yes, yes. In order to get 1 ton of lithium, just one, you will need 250 tons of rock. Or, if mining is carried out in a salt marsh, then it is necessary to process 750 tons of saline solution to extract 1 ton of lithium. At the same time, lithium can be purified from impurities only by chemical means. And this means that the rock and the salt solution, after lithium was taken out of it, cannot be used in any way. And it's all just thrown away. When oil is accidentally spilled somewhere, it is an environmental disaster. And when someone somewhere pours out tons of spent chemical brine after lithium separation, this is righteous waste for the benefit of the environment. Do not confuse. And the technological process is such that 1,900 tons of fresh water must be evaporated for 1 ton of lithium. Do you know who would use fresh water? Residents of Chile. Farmers in Chile are forced to import water from other countries for their fields, since all the water goes to the fucking lithium. And almost anything goes wrong. There's some kind of small drought or something. The population of Chile immediately remains without food and water. And I'm not talking about the tons of CO2, which are released when lithium is obtained. But this will not affect the whole wonderful and green Europushka in any way. The extraction of life is not in Europe. Well, let these plebeians deal with the consequences of production there, and we will live an eco-friendly life, with a righteous face and an eco badge on the refrigerator. In addition to lithium in batteries, there is also cobalt, which as a metal is rarer, and almost all the cobalt on the planet is mined in the Congo. This is such a poor country in Africa, with unstable government, economy and laws. Cobalt. This is one of the main things that the country lives on, and it is mined in mines. Do you know who produces cobalt in these mines? Children. Well, I mean, there are adults there too. After all, no one has cancelled the educators. But there are also children there. Cobalt, like lithium, has been actively mined for about 30 years. And before, child labor was actually used in the mines. Guess what has changed in 30 years of cobalt mining in the Congo? Nothing. They only gave birth to new children, otherwise the old ones were pronounced a little and that's it. He sometimes tries to protest against child labor there, but the Congo responds to everyone, do you need cobalt? Needed. Well, buy it, and leave our children alone. They still have to go to work tomorrow. Tons of processed and thrown out on the street rocks, interruptions in food and drink, child labor and hellish working conditions. It's all out there somewhere. It's not here, not in Europe. We have that diesel posed, that's the real problem. Look what a horror. And we will give birth to new children, well, in the sense that they will give birth there, and we will think about ecology here. But, the production of lithium and cobalt is half the trouble. Everyone has heard such a thing, that a discarded battery poisons some meters of land there. Cubic meters of land, I mean. And yes, indeed, if you just throw out the battery, then because of the chemical elements inside, it will poison the earth, poison groundwater, and generally kill all living things around it. It's true. And here I have a question in this regard. And what should we do with the batteries? The correct answer, dispose of. Yes, that's right. Nevertheless, we have seen such containers, where concerned people specially collect batteries, to give them for proper disposal. Do you know what percentage of batteries are being disposed of today, out of the total number in the world? Not in Russia, in the world. Here in that world with activists, feminists, the BT movement, with all these guys. How much? 2/3? Well, okay, 2/3 I waived it. Half, probably at least. It would already be good if there were half. 5%. 5% of the fucking batteries are being disposed of. The rest is simply thrown into the landfill or buried in the ground. And not because no one collects them, but because there is nowhere to dispose of them. Oh, where did you drive the horses? You don't understand anything. Right now there are just not enough batteries, so factories are not needed, and when they appear a lot, then there will be a lot of factories too. That's it. Yeah. All right, do you know how batteries are disposed of? You know. They are burned. I'm not kidding. They are burned. Wait, and the emissions that are formed when burning batteries are probably poisonous. Yes, poisonous. Yeah. And yes, nobody gives a shit, and the battery can't be completely burned yet. By the way, a lot of shit remains from it after burning. And what do they do with it? Can you guess? Buried in the ground, right? Yeah. Care and peace. She's like that. So far, there are no normal technologies for recycling batteries in the world. There are a bunch of experimental technologies, but they are all expensive, and none of them showed a normal result. Everything is now approximately at the level of molten metal. This is the technology on which Strong was manipulating. Today there are two main methods of recycling batteries. And both don't work, if anything. At the first, as I said, they are simply burned. This method is called pyrometallurgical. In the second case, the contents of the batteries are dissolved in chemicals. This method is called hydrometallurgical. But neither can be used on an industrial scale. And now I will explain why. The idea of recycling is what? So that you can disassemble the battery, do something with it there, and put the resulting materials back into production of new batteries. As with aluminum cans, for example, the jar was crushed, melted, and put back into production. Perfect. But with an aluminum can, everything is so simple because there is only aluminum. And the jar is the same everywhere. It is not necessary to disassemble it, ground into dust, and made the same. It's simple. With a battery for an electric car, you immediately run into the fact that before disposal, it should at least be disassembled. This is how such a battery looks like. In fact, this is a large monolithic thing made of smaller batteries. As a brick wall consists of bricks, so a large car battery consists of small ones, which are glued together with a special glue for greater strength. And when you need to disassemble the battery, this is how to do it. Is the glue strong? And all manufacturers have it still, which, different. Tesla, for example, generally uses some kind of secret alloy between the battery cells. And when you have everything different in size and strength, you can only disassemble it with your hands. And modern batteries are disassembled by hand during disposal. Human, living hands. Is it possible to get a chemical burn? You can. Is it possible to get poisoned? Of course. Included in the working conditions, it is impossible to robotize disassembly, since the robot needs a standardized, identical battery in all parameters. The robot will not understand if the battery is a little thicker, or a little stronger, or with a different glue. He needs thousands of identical batteries for a normal process, and this cannot even be in theory, since all cars are different. Everyone has different mounting points, shape, capacity, and so on. But, let's say that with the hands of a little African, or a little Chinese, we did pick up the battery. What to do next? In order for the material to be sent to a new production after processing, they need to be sorted into piles, and cleaned of impurities, without damaging anything in the process. And here is the main problem. Neither incineration, nor chemical purification, nor any other modern method can give you normal clean raw materials for production. Roughly speaking, if we recall aluminum cans, then this is what would happen if 10% of some kind of left-wing shit remained in the raw materials after processing. Of course, no one would have accepted this material for production, since aluminum is needed for the technological process, and that's it. There is no other way to make a bank. And this means that you need some other technological process to dig out these 10% of the shit from aluminum and get clean raw materials. But any additional process is an expense, and hence the rise in price of the finished product. And as a result, your aluminum after processing would cost much more than just ordinary aluminum. And who would buy such aluminum from you at double the price? That's right, no one. And that's the kind of bullshit that happens with batteries. All the raw materials that are obtained after processing are not only more expensive, they are also dirty. Neither cobalt, nor lithium, nor any other valuable metal for production is obtained as pure as from a quarry for its extraction. Yes, and from the quarry, it is also cheaper. And why buy recycled? Right? There's no need. And all the batteries already released at the moment are designed so that they cannot be recycled. They are all different in size and content, they are all different in composition and design, and there is no technology for their disposal. Recycling, and cannot exist. For recycling, all batteries must be absolutely identical ruble to ruble, like an aluminum can, but this cannot be in principle, due to their complexity of design. All modern lithium-ion batteries that already exist on the planet, and that will be produced in the next 10 to 15 years, will either be burned, and the remains buried in the ground, or simply buried in the ground. No options. The only option is to take a certain number of human hands and disassemble them into components, and then bury them in the ground anyway. And the production of such batteries is only gaining momentum under the friendly applause of green activists and hamsters, who can't see anything further than their nose. Do you know what happens to a battery in a landfill? It poisons the earth, poisons groundwater, and kills vegetation. The entire contents of the battery. These are chemically active and dangerous substances, and if you just leave them in a large volume in the ground, then all living things in this area are very quickly destroyed. And as soon as sales of electric cars with non-recyclable batteries jump up, after a while all these batteries will be in the ground. And it's a matter of time, unfortunately. And switching modern cars with an internal combustion engine with all their exhaust gas purification systems to an electric car is about the same as quitting smoking by switching to heroin. And the scientific community is screaming about it at the top of its lungs. But do you think someone is listening to scientists? No. They are listened to in much the same way as scientists who once studied the harm of lead in fuel. Again, I see a very cool irony in the fact that the battery that is under the hood of your car now is made of lead. A lithium-ion battery is no fucking more useful. And fluorine carbon. Also. Any battery is toxic, and nobody cares about it. Everyone stuck an eco badge on themselves. And they walk proud that they help the planet. The basic idea of all the restrictions and worries about ecology now sounds something like this. Let's think about the world where our children will live. Let's save nature for our children. And here is a similar populist palmistry. The real formulation of the state of affairs is as follows. We have already experimented with lead and exhaust emissions here in our generations. The result is so-so. So let's put an experiment on our children and grandchildren with toxic batteries. We will make a decision here now, earn money and political points, and the results of the experiment will still be raked by the next generation. So let them continue to think about what to do with toxic batteries all over the planet. That's what I'm getting at with this whole story. We will have to abandon the traditional internal combustion engine. This is a fact. Already solved, unfortunately. But this refusal is dictated not because there are bears or a glacier there. Oil and gasoline. It's not just something that we fill up in the car or look at quotes on TV. This is a very important resource that supports the entire modern economy. And it is important because it has become profitable. And not just like that by itself, but intentionally. People and Standard Oil saw potential in it and decided to plant the whole automotive world on gasoline, which they then sold to the whole world with a smile. Just as with the creation of lead Tetraethyls, all protection agencies and the state were ready to put up with several dozen deaths per production, since JAM and Standard Oil needed profit and the provision of thousands of jobs. They not only fed themselves, but thousands of families, and in general, pushed the economy of the whole country forward. And when scientists attacked them with the fact that the whole country was covered with lead, lawyers at meetings said that dirty money was better than an empty stomach. And they were right about that too. And what we are witnessing today is just a redistribution of power and resources under the guise of the fact that we are all fucking green and worried here. Modern ecology. This is a bargaining chip that is played in front of people to turn off their brains. The idea that one has to suffer for the sake of the next generations is always the argument in which any bullshit is justified, and which is given only when there are no other arguments. Remember any dictatorial regime, remember any monstrous things that happen in the world. And everywhere then, people were told that it was for the sake of the future of your children, for the sake of freedom and such bullshit. As I said at the very beginning about kerosene and blubber, whales were left behind only when cheaper and more convenient fuel appeared. It's the same with ecology. The real ecology will become necessary for everyone and important only at that moment and only on the condition that it will be obviously profitable here and now in monetary terms. After all, even human deaths, no matter how terrible a tragedy they are in themselves, are interested in states and big guys, only from the point of view that human deaths. It's not profitable. Every person who is born in any country of the world requires expenses for himself. The country invests in every citizen by providing healthcare, education, infrastructure, and everything around. Everything that you somehow received as a citizen for free maternity hospital, kindergarten, school, university, medicine, infrastructure, and other bullshit. The whole state paid for it from our taxes with you. And this is done only with the expectation that a healthy, educated, able-bodied citizen will work and pay taxes. And not only will it return the investments invested in it, it will also bring dividends, paying taxes all its life. This is how the economy works. The state cares about the health of citizens, not because there are ways to go. Look at what a healthy soldier has grown up here. Let me rub your cheek. No, because he is a healthy and educated citizen. It's profitable. The dumbest thing that can be is that you invested so much in a person, helped him, provided all sorts of social services, and he just died, the bastard. And the money in the pipe. And now to raise a new one at the age of 18. And no matter how cynical it may sound, but everything has a price. And industries, and environmental disasters, and each of us has a price tag. We just don't see it. And that's what type of car will be beneficial to these green ones. That's what we will drive with you. Not on what is convenient, what is right because of the environment, and what is good for white bears, but on what is profitable. But for these green ice is no longer profitable. In the world where decisions are made, where global issues are really solved, there is only one logic: money. And in this logic, there is no compassion for the coughing mining town. In this logic, there are no worries because of a rare caterpillar or because of the amount of snow in one place or another on the planet. Only a dry calculation in a stupid money supply. And these green guys will take away from us the rumbling of the engine, its sound, vibrations, and all that. The internal combustion engine, which some 100 years ago blew up the economy and provided profit, is no longer so profitable. And he himself is not to blame for this. The reason is in the global energy industry, which wants to abandon fossil resources. Money will understand. And ecology. Melting snowdrift in Antarctica. Not a teenager with Asperger's syndrome on stage. This is the screen that is being shown to you. And the more you will put pressure on your emotions, the more you will believe in this screen. And behind this screen, leverage, politics, power, and money. However, as always. And that's why electric cars go to fuck, not like cars, but as a product of the political redistribution of power. And as something that will help us solve environmental problems. They won't solve anything, and it's possible to make it worse. But our children, whom no one asked about anything, will deal with these consequences instead of us. Digest all this, and I, with your permission, will take my leave and go light up my gasoline tank. While I'm still allowed. We're fucked.